Right. Here we go. Can everybody hear me? Might seem to be on function. All right, so we will call this meeting to order. And the first order of business, as always, is the reminder that North Carolina General Statute 138:15 requires me at the beginning of each meeting to remind members of their duty to avoid conflict of interest and to disclose any known conflicts of interest related to matters on the agenda today. Do any members have any conflicts of interest to disclose? Being none, I will ask Ms. Thomas to call the roll.
Here.
David. Present. Here. Present. Maggie Marner, I'm here. Supervisor. Eric. Steve King.
Here.
David Kellyson. Here. Dr. Estuary. John Adams.
Present.
And Don Fowler.
Here.
Thank you. And so Commissioner Harris had a conflict today. She had a happy conflict in that one of her sons is graduating from college in Charlotte. So that is definitely an excused absence. Dr. Lazoric is not attending because she has had exposure to a family member who's tested positive for COVID. So not to come in those circumstances. She may be able to participate online. We're not certain whether that will. So otherwise. President, the next order of business is approval of the minutes from the March meeting, which everyone should have received. Are there any comments on or corrections to the draft minutes? If not, is there an option to approve the minutes as drafted? To approve the minutes. Vice Chair Modest moves approval. Is there a second? Commissioner King. Commissioner King, second. Favor, say aye. Any opposed, no. Thank you very much. So the next item on the agenda is the action item, which is request for approval of the hearing officer's report on proposed revisions to the Title V rules, final approval of the regulatory impact analysis. So I'll first turn to Commissioner Duggan, who currently serves as the hearing officer, and then BAQ staff will also.
is a data approval for modifications to 15A NCAC 02Q.0103. There are numerous revisions presented here. However, the majority of those revisions are correct typographical errors to with the requirements of 40 CFR 70 to make changes to create the correct reference. There was a hearing that was held on February 23rd. There was no speakers, thankfully, as my first. I didn't screw it up too bad. But I'd like to thank the staff for preparing me well for the hearing. Staff, please.
You just identify yourself for the record.
Thank you. I'm Catherine Quinlan. I'm with the Division of Air Quality. And we'll just share this presentation. All right. So like I said, I'm Catherine Quinlan. I'm with the Division of Air Quality, and I'll be going over our hearing record for the Title V rule revisions. So for a little bit of brief background, in August 2001, EPA approved North Carolina's Title V operating permit program. There were 3 program reviews by EPA in 2005, 2010, and 2014. In 2020, EPA initiated the 4th program review, and as part of that, they provided us with comments on our Title V rules early last year. So DAQ is proposing revisions to our rules to address those comments. So as mentioned, we had a virtual public hearing on February 23rd. Commissioner Duggan served as the hearing officer, and we had a comment period from January 18th through March 21st. We only received, as mentioned, there were no oral comments received at the virtual public hearing. We received 1 comment letter that was from EPA Region 4, and it contained 2 comments. So there were 14 rules proposed for amendment. As I mentioned, 1 comment letter was received from EPA Region 4, and they had 2 comments. Changes were made to one of the proposed rules, 02Q 0504, as a result of these comments. So the first comment that we received from EPA was regarding DAQ's intention to submit an updated Attorney General's opinion, and that was to cite the new 18-month requirement for taking final action on permit applications. EPA recommended that the updated Attorney General's opinion that we'll be submitting demonstrate adequacy with the Part 70 judicial review provisions considering the revised regulations. And so we've noted this recommendation, and we intend to submit an updated Attorney General's opinion that demonstrates adequacy with the Part 70 judicial review provisions. And then the second comment, EPA noted a typo in 02Q 504C, and we have revised that language as suggested. So since the proposed revisions are primarily administrative or updates to align our rules with the Part 70 requirements, no economic impact is expected. OSBM determined that the amendments have little to no impact on state or local governments and no substantial economic impact, and they've approved our regulatory impact analysis. So an updated timeline, here we are in May requesting adoption by the EMC. If we receive that approval, then we estimate a tentative effective date of July 1st. And with that, the recommendation is that the EMC recommends that the proposed amendments to 15A NCAC 02Q 0103 and 500, as presented in Chapter 2 of the hearing report, the final regulatory impact analysis as presented in Chapter 6 of the hearing report, and the hearing officer's report be adopted by the Environmental Management Commission. And with that, I can take any questions.
Are there any questions for Ms. Quinlan? I believe at the March meeting, the specific rules. If not, is there a motion to approve the hearing officers report and the rest?
All right, that's so moved.
Commissioner Duggan moves the motion. Commissioner Arado seconds the motion. Further discussion? If not, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Thank you.
So the next item on the agenda, action item, is under request to approve reappointments of the water control system operator certification and commission, which is quite a mouthful. Individual Water Resources, Mr. Algal Mats. You want? And if not, we will move on and come back to that another time.
We have to make a motion to approve it, so it's all right.
Well, that's true. I suppose we can move on if there are no questions or concerns about the proposed nominations. We can go ahead and move those further to the presentation. Mr. Bailey?
To stay on to the names commissions that we have. When I was with NRCD, and I think that they have wonderful qualifications, and I'm proud of that. Volunteers commission is very important, because they're the ones that are the people saying that control the discharge of into our water. So I'm going to approve these things.
Is there a second to the motion? I'll second. Commissioner Davis, second to the motion. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, no. Thank you, those are approved. The next item on the agenda is an information item, and this is a presentation about managing nutrients in North Carolina. In discussion with the department, we realized there are quite a number of nutrient-related issues that will be coming back to the commission for decision in the coming months, and it would be a good time to revisit how we started into this process and what's upcoming in the next few months to year. And so, our presenter, Ms. Rowland, you can begin your presentation.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. My name is Kelsey Rowland, and I work in the non-point source planning unit of the Division of Water Resources. And I've been coordinating the nutrient criteria development plan since the beginning of the year, taking over for Jim Hawhey. I'm here today to tell you about the importance of managing nutrients in North Carolina's waters and give you a brief history of the NCDP and the progress we have made so far. And then I will pass you over to my supervisor, Rich Gannon, to update you on the status of High Rock Lake nutrient management strategy. Nutrients, namely nitrogen and phosphorus, are the most widespread stressor impacting rivers and streams. Nutrients can come from a number of diffuse sources on the landscape, including agriculture, stormwater, wastewater, fossil fuels, and residences. And the increase in paved and modified surfaces on developed land then augments and accelerates the conveyance of nutrients into water bodies. Nationwide, 58% of rivers and streams and 45% of lakes have excess levels of phosphorus. Additionally, 2/3 of the nation's coastal areas and more than 1/3 of estuaries are impaired by nutrients. Excess nutrients contribute to harmful algal blooms, areas of low oxygen known as dead zones, and high levels of nitrates that contaminate water used for recreation, drinking water, wildlife, pets and livestock, and aquatic life, which wreaks an economic toll as well. The map on the left here shows a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico that formed in the 1970s, which at its largest was equivalent in size to New Jersey. Similar dead zones caused by excess nutrients in the Chesapeake Bay led to the development of their own nutrient management strategy affecting 5 states. Excess nutrients can cause pervasive algal blooms as well, including toxic species. On the right, you'll see a picture of a water sample collected in Lake Erie in 2014, about 2.5 miles off the shore of Ohio. Tests on the city of Toledo's water supply that summer revealed high levels of toxins, likely caused by algae in the lake. From a public health standpoint, toxic algae growth can cause respiratory problems and skin irritation in both humans and animals. Focusing in on North Carolina, the low dissolved oxygen caused by algal blooms can lead to fish kills and loss of aquatic habitat. On the top left photo, you'll see a massive fish kill in Cypress Lake, which is a tributary to Wilson Creek, which drains to the Trent River in New Bern. Top right, you'll see an algal bloom in Waterville Lake in the northern parts of Hayward County that tested positive for a toxin with potential to cause skin rashes and to affect liver functions. Bottom left shows algal blooms in Queen Anne's Creek and the Chowan River that occurred in 2015. And the bottom right shows serious algal blooms in Tarboro in the Tar-Pamlico Basin. To address these issues, EPA issued a Federal Register notice in 2001 encouraging states to develop nutrient management plans. In response, North Carolina developed the Nutrient Criteria Implementation Plan in 2004. The NCIP did not lay out any timelines or strong goals to demonstrate North Carolina's commitment to developing nutrient criteria. So in 2011, EPA issued a memo to the regions re-emphasizing the need for nutrient reductions. To gain stakeholder input on nutrient reductions, the North Carolina Forum on Nutrient Over-Enrichment was held, and DWR incorporated the stakeholder comments and established the Nutrient Criteria Development Plan, or the NCDP, in 2014. The NCDP was then renewed in 2019 with some changes made. The NCDP is a plan for developing nutrient criteria for surface waters in North Carolina by linking the criteria to the designated uses of the water body, including downstream uses. The uses include being fishable, swimmable, and boatable, as well as special uses such as trout waters, primary nursing areas, and public water supplies. The plan includes evaluating causal and response variables such as nutrients, chlorophyll A, pH, or dissolved oxygen. The plan also allows for the criteria to be expressed numerically or narratively with a numerical translator. The NCDP recognizes that different water body types warrant different nutrient criteria due to their characteristics such as landscape position, flow dynamics, and sensitive species. The plan commits to developing separate criteria for lakes and reservoirs, rivers and streams, and estuaries. The one pilot water body was chosen for each type of water body for criteria development. Then based off of each pilot area, criteria could be developed for similar water body types. The pilot water bodies as shown here are High Rock Lake, the Admiral Sound / Chowan River, and the Central Cape Fear River. To aid the NCDP, the Scientific Advisory Council was established in the 2014 NCDP to assist DWR with the development of scientifically defensible nutrient criteria. The EPA was asked to participate on the SAC. Members include experts in water quality, nutrient response variables, nutrient management, and nutrient abatement. The Criteria Implementation Committee, the CIC, was established in 2015 to advise DWR on the social and fiscal impacts of the proposed nutrient criteria. Members include economists, academics, stakeholder representatives such as local governments and agriculture. The first pilot area addressed was High Rock Lake. Ongoing eutrophication concerns led to recommendations for a nutrient management strategy for High Rock Lake in the early 1990s. High Rock Lake was first listed as impaired for chlorophyll A in 2004. An intensive monitoring contract was awarded to the Npd River Basin Association with data collection happening from 2008 to 2010. Then 2 types of models were developed. The first, a watershed model, links conditions and activities on the land surface to responses in the stream and delivery to the lake. The watershed model report was issued in 2016. Secondly, the nutrient response model provides information on the responses of the lake to nutrient loading, and this was completed in 2016. The NCDP then began consultation with the SAC and CIC in 2015, meeting more than 30 times over 5 years, resulting in final recommendations that were made in May of 2020. The High Rock Lake site-specific standard went out for public comment at the end of last year and will be brought back before the commission later this summer. We are now actively working on the estuary criteria in the Admiral Sound and Chowan River. So in March 2016, EPA's Nutrient Scientific Technical Exchange Partnership, the NSTEPS program, funded a report by Tetra Tech, and various statistical and correlational analyses were performed for nutrient-related data. In December 2017, the Phase 1 report was completed with a summary of potential research projects to support nutrient criteria development. The biggest recommendations coming from that report were related to developing a clarity standard for the Admiral. In 2019, the NCDP revision added the lower portion of the Chowan River to the pilot area. And in 2020, 2 major research projects were funded. The first being a bio-optical model of the sound, which you'll hear more about, and a remote sensing project. Also in 2020, meetings were held with the SAC, in which staff determined that they would not pursue a dissolved oxygen criteria in the region because there are a few dissolved oxygen issues apparent in the lower Chowan and the Admiral. So we will continue to monitor these trends. And in 2021, we met with staff from Maryland and Virginia to discuss their monitoring and assessment of nutrient criteria in the Chesapeake Bay. In 2022, the NCDP calls for us to create clarity and chlorophyll A criteria recommendations by the end of the year, and we are currently working on those. And we have a meeting planned next month with the SAC to discuss a proposed clarity criteria proposal. This time, the next presentation will delve further into the nutrient management strategy in High Rock Lake, and you'll also hear more about the clarity assessment in the Admiral Sound. So if you have any questions at this time.
Any questions about the nutrient process? And just a reminder to commissioners to speak into your microphone. Thank you. Mr. King.
On the developing site-specific standards and on lakes, estuaries, and rivers. Can you be more specific on the sites are chosen on your studies?
That's a great question. Well, the 3 divisions had to do with the major freshwater body types and in the state. I wasn't here for when they were choosing the pilot water body area, so I'd have to refer to someone else to tell you more about that.
And my thoughts, Chair, is that when we develop site-specific standards, we be real clear in the mapping process, pulling out these sites around the state. So the flooding, agriculture, and then profiling these areas and setting up rules for these areas. I just hope that that's part of the study, environmental justice fees, and the profiling different parts of the state when we start talking about developing site-specific standards. That's just my concern with the study and relevant mapping and so forth and so forth.
Thank you, Mr. Keenan. It's possible our other speakers may have something to say about it as well. Commissioner Dearwood? Thank you for the presentation of certificates. Could you talk a little bit more again about the dissolved oxygen position? I think you were saying not pursuing it this time. And then also address sediment and water.
Sure. So for dissolved oxygen, that was discussed back in 2020 in a series of SAC meetings. And the consensus at the time was that there weren't very many dissolved oxygen issues apparent in the monitoring that took place in the sound at that time. So they weren't considering it a strong correlation to nutrient issues in the reservoir. But it's something that we'll continue to monitor, and if there become dissolved oxygen issues, then we can pursue further criteria. And then in regards to sediment, currently we're working on a clarity standard that will help us determine areas that are having concerns with clarity, which includes total suspended solids and chlorophyll A as kind of secondary response variables. So if there are areas that are not achieving the clarity standard, then we would be looking at sediment as well as chlorophyll A and natural conditions to determine the cause.
Any other questions? Ms. Rowland? And if not, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we'll hear from Mr. Gannon, specifically concerning the High Rock Lake nutrient management strategy.
Good morning, Madam Chairman, members of the commission. Thank you for having me. Joey Hester, I supervise the non-point source planning branch for DWR. Joey Hester is leading the High Rock Lake nutrient management strategy development. He is out sick today. He regrets not being able to be here, but I'm sure you'll be seeing him sometime soon. So I'm happy to cover the development process for a nutrient strategy for the lake this morning. We thought it would be worthwhile to spend a minute on the water quality history of the lake first. And it's not a new lake like many of the lakes in the Yadkin chain. It's been around since the early part of the 20th century. 1920s it was dammed, unlike, I would point out, Falls and Jordan Lakes, which were impounded in the 80s. So potentially some different issues there due to that. We understand that it's been considered eutrophic since at least the 1970s. In 1992, a DWP Lakes assessment found it to be one of the most eutrophic lakes in the state. And it's been officially impaired since 2004 for chlorophyll A and associated parameters. And since then, it's been about same or somewhat worse. So what you're looking at with these maps, the print's a little hard to read, but I want to walk you through it for a minute. If you can see the blue color in the upper left on the, so these are the 2016 and 2018 maps of the integrated report findings, and they illustrate the impairments in the lake. The light blue color in the upper left is the only unimpaired segment of the entire lake, unfortunately, and that is the main stem river entering at the top. And then you see this orange color covers about half of the lake, and that is a combination of overlapping chlorophyll A and turbidity impairments. The Yadkin's known to be a very turbid river, and so, but yet the lake has managed and manages to produce chlorophyll despite the turbidity in the upper half, and to the extent that it's impaired for turbidity, for chlorophyll A as well as turbidity for that reach. Then we move into a pink color, which is actually 3 impairments overlapping. So we're adding a pH impairment, which suggests that the turbidity is settling out enough for productivity to really kick up, such that it also drives pH up into the basic, into exceedances of the standard at 9 for that stretch. Then we move into finally the yellow color in the lower portion, which after the turbidity is settled out, then we're left with just chlorophyll A and pH impairments all the way to the dam. So you might say the lake is fully impaired and has been for a while, and just by way of commentary, strikingly worse off, I would say, than either Jordan or Falls that we have been dealing with in recent years. In terms of management actions so far for nutrients, there have been limits placed. The Abbott's Creek arm, which is at the bottom of the lake, the long, thin yellow line going up to the right is the Abbott's Creek arm. 3 wastewater facilities there received summer phosphorus limits in around 2004. And well, with respect to current conditions, speaking with the regional office, we understand that they regularly receive calls for algal mats, primarily black mat algae, which is a filamentous blue-green that forms extensive mats in the lake. It's considered a nuisance to boat. It's known to be a nuisance to boaters. It's unsightly. It can produce odors. Has the potential for toxin production that can cause skin rashes. I don't know that there's any reported cases of that yet. And they tell us that in 3 out of 4 seasons, they find extensive mats of this algae. Wanted to make a brief note of some regulatory history that is relevant here. 2005 session law for drinking water supply reservoirs called on the EMC to set nutrient criteria for drinking water supply reservoirs across the state, specifically address Jordan and Falls, and then also put a blanket prohibition on new or increased loads in wastewater permits until for any of these reservoirs where we have produced a lake response model for nutrients until rules are adopted by the EMC and become effective. So we have received inquiries from a few dischargers about the potential for increased loads. So clearly we're trying to move forward as efficiently as possible into this rulemaking process. In terms of that, Kelsey provided a nice coverage of sort of the first 2 sections of this timeline for the rulemaking. Since the nutrient standards form the foundation for establishing the magnitude of reduction needs in nutrient inputs to the lake, we didn't start initiating a management strategy process while the SAC was working on it. And so their process took up through 2020, and as their deliberations were settling out, and they were zeroing in on a chlorophyll A recommendation, the Dischargers Association, the Yadkin PD River Basin Association, developed a proposal for a regulatory approach that in their view would be the most cost-effective and beneficial for everyone, primarily focused on point sources, but covering everything. So they provided that to us in 2020. That was helpful. Since then, in 2021, as you know, staff received the SAC's recommendations in 2020 and then built on those to develop the chlorophyll A standard proposal that you've had before you. That is scheduled to come back, I think, in July. So you'll be hearing more on that. And we also began our sort of internal evaluation of the evidence, the data, combining that with our experience with previous nutrient strategies to work on potential strategy design elements. And then this year, Joey has gotten very busy, starting reaching out to individual stakeholders, evaluating, finding out about their concerns and their needs, sharing ours and the lake's needs and the process going forward. we've been able to set up a contract for facilitation for the stakeholder process. And we just got word last week that that contract is in place. So we're looking forward to getting rolling on the rulemaking. This is a rough timeline of what we project for it. We're looking at about 6 months perhaps of initial stakeholder engagement. And from that, hoping to come away with some rule concept options that we can take back and work up draft language over for several months and bring that back to the stakeholders for another round before we move into the rulemaking process, the formal, where we come to the committee and request to go forward and then move into fiscal analysis. And once we get that approved, coming back for approval to go out, have a comment period that takes us through late 24 and early 25 by this, and then adoption and on to the RRC, and hopefully no wickets with the General Assembly after that. This is a list of the stakeholders that Joey has been communicating with and had meetings with so far. And he's continuing to do that. I've been in several of them. They've been very productive so far, and we are looking forward to moving into the sort of the full stakeholder stage quite soon. So that's the summary, and happy to take any questions.
Commissioner Saunders.
I thought, Kelsey gave me a different timeline than what you just gave. What's coming to us in July?
In July, that's the plan for the Core FLA standard. Should be
For High Rock Lake.
for High Rock Lake, Core FLA standard coming back in July.
And you've had a public hearing on that.
Yep, that was last fall, November.
Commissioner Davis is the
That's right.
hearing officer. So that's just the 4th standard.
Right.
Back.
Right.
And there'll be some discussions about that, but that's not part of the next version that's coming in 2023 or 2024.
Right. We're sort of anticipating that the Core FLA standard will settle out with, something close to what's been proposed and taken out to hearing. That will come back to you in July, September at the worst. But in the meantime, we can go ahead and get started with the management strategy development. Mm-hmm.
And that'll take another public hearing.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Sure. These are those that Joey's been in contact and had meetings with so far. Is that what you wanted, Mary? Okay.
Resident of Southern Davidson County. Who's down there. I think their intake for drinking water is just below the line. I think they need to get involved.
Okay. Thank you for that.
Commissioner Solomon.
Yeah, this the, we deal with this on some of the news, but some of these associations have a lot of members on them, and a lot of them are municipalities. It would be helpful for us, like when I see the Acton PD River Basin Association, just to understand who all's in there. I got the home builders and I got those kind of people, but there's a lot of varied interest in that community.
Yeah, right. And that is, it's the dischargers. I know that the Riverkeeper participates in their meetings as well. They have contracted expertise to help guide them through the process. We've been interacting with their contractor as well. Well, I guess their manager is also a contracted.
Yeah, I don't want to oversimplify, but they're taking the Pfas Association and kind of flipped it over the same kind of model over the Acton PD.
I think so.
A lot of the discharges, power utility, I think the power HDR to be their manager or their technical people, correct?
Well, there's also a water quantity association.
There's Water Quality Association. Too.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And my point, Madam Chairwoman, was just, and Rich knows, but we just understand who all behind these things is always helpful. Because it would fill up probably 2 pages of
Yeah, and
That is a good point, because some of these associations do represent a lot. Are there other questions or comments? Mr. Key?
I'm sorry, Commissioner?
In the state that would follow.
Oh, in terms of being impaired, I don't have a good answer. I can say that Piedmont reservoirs tend to be, it doesn't, tend to be impaired if you look hard enough. If you have the sampling resources, they're more prone to it than other lakes in the state.
Thought was, Madam Chair, that I proceed moving forward with this particular reservoir as a standard for others. That look at that and setting other reservoirs that have potential issues.
And I'll address part of that question.
The time period, the blocks of time, that just is a long time out.
It is a long time out. All of these nutrient processes have been lengthy processes for members who've been around for a long period of time. Commissioner Deerhake has been through the Falls Lake and Jordan Lake. So we have gone through this process before with other nutrient impaired water bodies. It is a lengthy process because it is in effect site specific. Each time the EMC and the department have looked at these nutrient issues, it's involved a model of the particular water body to look at what all of the inputs are and get a good picture of what needs to be controlled. So in fact, we have had something of a model with Falls Lake and Jordan Lake because we've gone through this in similar circumstances. Unfortunately, I'm not sure there's a shortcut in which you can totally pick up the results of one and apply that to another because you are looking at all the particular inputs in a geographic area in a watershed. But if Mr. Gannon would like to add anything else to that.
That's exactly on point. If I can add to that, I think the intent with these pilot water bodies for reservoir, flowing stream, and the estuary was, the hope was that we could develop a process and a set of some thinking that would be transferable to other reservoirs in the state. But of course, as you know, science is science, and once you dig into the details, it's difficult to just to say. And I think when they brought the recommendations forward, the SAC, clear that these are specific recommendations for the High Rock Reservoir. Yeah. And it's difficult to stay out of the gate that they're really transferable to other water bodies.
Can I follow up with
I'm sorry, Commissioner King, yes.
Just one final thought is that my thought is moving forward, Eastern North Carolina, particular saltwater intrusion, quality of water quality, groundwater and so forth, and having the access to properties that would be possibly permitted for reservoirs and mapping out those areas and bringing those into the study as well as we move forward in reservoirs. Every time you pick a reservoir, then is that reservoir being set, these rules or potential rules being set for those particular reservoirs and what science is indicating in those areas. For those potential reservoirs, the water.
Right, and I think you make a very good point, and the process actually has been relatively consistent across the different reservoirs, and as Mr. Gannon indicated, the intent of the nutrient plan at this point is to try to look at a nutrient impaired lake, High Rock Lake, then look at Albemarle Sound, and then look at a free-flowing river, and try to get, a fairly consistent process. I think the issue comes at the end of the process process when you have to develop specific standards and management strategies, and that's going to vary depending on the conditions in a particular water body. Thank you. Were there other questions or comments? Commissioner Sav?
I'm trying to bring it back up, but I do agree with everybody that our lakes and our rivers and reservoirs, our major ones are different and are unique. I do think there is some opportunity in eastern North Carolina with our small shallow lakes, as they call moccasins, but the Waccamaw, the White Lake, the Phelps, the Mesquite, they all have similar characteristics. And I fear, and this two-part question, there could be some tippling or some common things, but I fear they're not going to get to in any length of time because of the major rivers and reservoirs, and maybe a comment on that. And then my main comment that I had asked Mr. Smith a while back, when he was director, was, is there any of this, all this federal money that's coming to us and the state money's been appropriated, are we putting any money into nutrient management at a local level, like these different local governments and utilities, are we really, I know we're investing in water and sewer plants, I know we're investing in roads and airports. Are we really getting money into this, Rich?
Well, I may not be the best person, well, I'm not the best person to speak to the latter question, but there is a chunk of money, and DWI has been advertising. We're doing some listening sessions on utilization of ARPA stormwater funds for stormwater improvements, and I think that can include what tends to be called green infrastructure, improvements that will help both quantity and quality. And so a lot of that work can feed directly into these nutrient strategies.
Yeah, and I understand it, and I think we agree. I don't think there's enough money looking at the different nutrient specimens and species, I should say, and really analyzing that. It's getting swept up with other things and not being specifically addressed.
Right.
Conditions.
And just if I could add, I mean, we see that the proliferation of impairments, as people saw yesterday with the basin plan, Rocky River watershed in particular. Certainly, and so we are thinking about ways that we can find more nimble or efficient processes as perhaps an overlay on these more cumbersome rulemakings to try to address eutrophication impairments without having to, or in addition to going through these slower exercises.
Any other questions? Commissioner Deerhag?
I would just let Commissioner Solomon know that we heard a presentation in Water Quality Committee in March, multiple presentations on state and federal infrastructure funding coming in. And one of the things that we stressed to staff there is what is the performance of the dollars invested, and nutrient reduction should be one of those key indicators of performance. So.
Any other questions or comments? If not, our next speaker is Mr. Kenworthy, who is a member of the Scientific Advisory Council, and who will be talking about some of the work that's been done to date on the next set of issues related to Albemarle Sound and the Chowan River.
So someone switch the shows. Okay. Well, start off with Madam Chairman and the Commission. I want to thank all of you for the opportunity to come and speak today. And as the Chairman mentioned, I'm actually one of the members of the NCDP Scientific Advisory Council. I also work with the Albemarle National Estuary Partnership, working on their Scientific Technical Advisory Council as well as their monitoring and assessment team. And what I'm going to speak about today is the work that's related to, or at least a portion of the work that's related to the SAC, and just touch on some highlights. I think you all have been provided a sort of an executive summary of the work that's being done, and as well as reference to a report that's been produced and that was funded by the Algal National Estuary Partnership to help support the staff by Dr. Nathan Hall. And I'm going to speak to a few items out of that report and some other general items. So the topic today is submerged aquatic vegetation. And in case some of you are not familiar with what we refer to when we're talking about SAV is the acronym that we use. These are the plants that grow in our estuary that are completely submerged, almost their entire lifetime. So when you think about a salt marsh, you see the salt marsh. Sometimes it's immersed in water at a high tide, but most of the time it lives in the air. These plants that I'm talking about today almost always live underwater. And you can go to the coast in our tidal systems and you can actually see it exposed, but it's a short period of time that they actually get exposed. So these plants, unlike the marshes, are really sensitive to the quality of the water because they're underwater all the time. And one of those issues that is most important, and the one that I'm going to speak a lot about today, is the clarity of the water. They're plants that need light. They need to photosynthesize. So I'll give you a little background on SAV in North Carolina. If you look at the panel on the left side of the graph, that bright yellow signature there along the coast and back in our rivers and, up here in Albemarle Sound, the Pamlico, and the Neuse, and then all along our coast. That yellow is what we refer to as the historical maximum extent of SAV that we've observed and documented since about 1980. So we've taken this composite of observations, scientific studies, surveys, and actual mapping efforts. And what we've done is put them all together and say, this is what we've observed in North Carolina in the last almost 5 decades. And that is about 190,000 acres. And that's big. That's a lot. In fact, on the Atlantic seaboard, North Carolina has the largest SAV resource. And it has a lot of benefits. And that's why it's important that we consider protecting it. It's critical fish habitat. It's nursery area. It provides food for many of our commercial and recreational fisheries. It's also important wildlife habitat. And for those of you who are waterfowl hunters or bird watchers, this is an important critical habitat. We're the centerpiece of the Atlantic flyway when it comes. And we have a lot of waterfowl that come to North Carolina that either feed directly on our SAV or they feed on something that grows and depends and lives on it. SAV are also important to sustain environmental quality. They are a biological filtration system. They're just like a wastewater treatment plant. They capture sediments, they trap them, they keep them there, they help keep the water clean, they capture nutrients, they sequester them in their biomass, they put them into the sediments, they recycle them. They act just like a wastewater treatment plant, only it's natural and it's all relatively inexpensive and free. They also produce lots of oxygen that aerate the water, and that's what the fish need. That's what our shellfish need, is high quality water with lots of oxygen. And if you take all of that and add it together and compute the value of it, that resource is world-class. It's worth tens to hundreds of millions of dollars per year to our coastal economy and to our regional economy. And it's an extremely valuable resource. And that's one of the reasons we need to protect it. But we also need to consider protecting it because we're losing it. It's actually declining. At 190,000 so acres that we've documented historically, we've lost about 30 to 50% of it in the last 5 decades. In some areas, the losses are very large. Some areas, like up here on the north shore of Albemarle Sound, we've recently documented the complete disappearance of SAV, going from almost 100% cover to 0% cover. The other thing we've observed in these 5 decades is that where we've monitored the SAV habitat area very closely, and where we expect to see SAV to grow and perhaps gain an area, it's just not doing it. We're not seeing gains. They're very, very rare. So what we're seeing is a net change, a change that trend is actually negative. And we know from work that's been done up and down the Atlantic seaboard in the Gulf of Mexico, literally around the world, that the biggest issue that we have with water quality is water clarity. And that's the main reason that many of our systems are actually losing SAV. And that's one of the reasons that we're particularly concerned and interested in developing a water clarity-based protective measure for SAV. So the light requirements of SAV are really, really high. They're rooted plants. They grow in sediment or soils underwater that are always saturated with water. And what that means is that the sediments they grow in, unlike many of the sediments on land, are anaerobic. All the metabolism that's going on is anaerobic metabolism. The result of anaerobic metabolism is the production of hydrogen sulfides and other phytotoxins that are poisonous to the plants. So these plants have to have enough light to produce their own biomass, to reproduce, but they also have to pump oxygen into the sediments to aerate. And so what we do on land is we dig drainage ditches and drain the water out. Well, you can't do that in an SAV habitat. They have to pump enough oxygen, so they need a lot more light than other plants. And in fact, if you compare the light requirements of SAV, they're on the order of 10 to 20 times higher than our phytoplankton, our chlorophyll component in our estuaries. So they have an enormous requirement for light. And as you can see, just by comparing those numbers, if you compare our phytoplankton chlorophyll to SAV, you can see pretty quickly that a standard for chlorophyll is not going to be suitable for SAV, that it has a much higher light requirement. So what I want to talk about today is in reference to this refocusing of the Coastal Habitat Protection Plan on water quality and engagement with stakeholders to help us, figure out how we can maintain water clarity sufficient enough for these plants to grow. So what I'm going to refer to today is these 2 recommended actions that are in Chapter 4 of the KIP. This is the work that I'm associated with my colleagues and others on the SAC, and that our marching orders is to provide you with guidance on establishing these water quality standards for light penetration for these plants. That's 4.7. And then our second job is to move forward with looking a little further at some of those factors that affect water clarity, in particular, the chlorophyll A water quality standard. What do there? So I'm going to update you on the scientific progress that we made. Not all of it, just a small part of it. There isn't enough time today, but I'd be happy to speak to any of you at any time or anyone that wants to speak in more detail about Dr. Hall's report. And what we've done the last couple of years since the workshop we held here in Raleigh, based on which formed sort of the foundation of Chapter 4 of the CHIP with respect to water quality, we contracted Dr. Nathan Hall from the University of North Carolina Institute of Marine Science, and he began a study that is looking at all the water clarity metrics for the protection of submerged aquatic vegetation. And one of the results of Nathan's study, and I hope you have an opportunity to read his report sometime, or at least read the executive summary, is This is the first ever, most comprehensive assessment of water quality related to water clarity in our entire coastal area, and that's of extreme value. The second part of his investigation is looking at how we can use a bio-optical model to establish and monitor scientifically defensible water quality criteria, especially water clarity. And so what I'm going to do now is spend just a few minutes introducing you to this model and showing you what progress we've made with it and where we stand in moving forward. So what is a bio-optical model? It's pretty basically simple. The optical properties of the water are really determined by the water itself absorbing light, scattering light, and the amounts of three constituents. Of course, you're all familiar with several, probably all three of these. The first one is what we refer to as a color dissolved organic matter, and you see it right there in the example. We call it CDOM. This is what gives the sort of brick colored, copper color to water. The second one is the chlorophyll, which I know you're all familiar with, which gives the green color, and the third one is the suspended particulate material, which we refer to as turbidity. Now, using some fundamental laws of physics, which are really basic, we can actually calibrate the scattering and absorbing properties of each one of these elements. And then we can take those and we can actually add them together, shown here at the top. We can take the scattering and absorption properties of chlorophyll, turbidity, CDOM, and water, and run them through the computer model and actually calculate the percentage of light that's reaching plants at any depth. And it's technically complex, but it's fundamentally very simple. What it provides us with is an opportunity to do an objective classification of the stressors that are affecting the light in the water. So let me walk you through this. I'm going to start right here where it says Sav Light Requirement. This is something we know, we've studied, we understood, it's been empirically determined. For our high salinity Sav, it's 22%. And we know from decades of observation that we expect our high salinity Sav, or we call seagrasses, to grow to about 1.7 meters water depth. So if we know those two and we combine the chlorophyll and the turbidity and the CDOM and assume, of course, the water is constant, we can actually calculate how much light is reaching the bottom or reaching these plants. And any point that's in this area beneath this red line, which is our threshold, would be an acceptable condition. If we go out and monitor the water column and we find that points fall out here above that, those are unacceptable conditions. And that's fundamentally how we start working with this model. And then, of course, we can collect a lot of data, months, years, weeks, however long we can, and we can actually see what stressor is mostly affecting the light in the system. And we can relate it directly to our SMD. So this is where we actually bridge the gap between management implications, stakeholder engagement. Because if we can isolate what is having the most effect on light, we can target that particular stress. So for example, over here with chlorophyll, we know it's made worse by point and non-point source nutrient pollution. So we target that metric. What practices can we do? What improvements can we make to reduce the chlorophyll? Second one over here is turbidity. This is another one that we can work with and target, and we can adjust. That metric in a way through management practices. For example, we can work on living shorelines to stabilize sediments. We can work with agriculture to reduce the amount of sediment that leaves farm fields, and we can work with developers to improve stormwater retention of sediment. So this is how the model works. We can't do much with CDOM. But CDOM is a very important component. And chlorophyll and turbidity are the two that are most commonly monitored. And we rarely monitor CDOM, but I'm going to show you that we need to monitor CDOM. Now, our system has a lot of variability in the salinity, but there's a gradient in salinity in our system. And you can see these dark blues over here in the eastern part of the Pamlico Sound and down here in Core and Back Sound. These are all salinities that near ocean conditions. They're higher salinities. That's where our seagrasses grow. As we move up into the rivers and up into Currituck Sound and Algal Sound, the salinity drops dramatically so that we're in salinities between 0 and 10 or 12 parts per thousand. And along that gradient, the colored dissolved organic matter in the system increases dramatically. So we may not be able to manage CDOM, but we need to factor it in because it does affect light attenuation. So what we end up with in North Carolina is, you can't see it on the top there, two personalities of SAB, both in the SAB themselves, biological personalities, and second, in the environment that they actually live in. So we have this high salinity environment with 3 species of SAB. And then over here in the rivers and sounds in our low salinity environment, we have a different SAB community. Fundamentally the same, they all grow underwater, they're vascular plants, but they're also living in different environmental conditions. The low salinity SAB, it's more proximal to our landscape. So what we do on land and what we're doing in the rivers is going to have a more immediate effect than it would have over here in the eastern part of the system, where we have a lot of tidal basing and inlets that are flushing water and shorter residence times. So there are different sediments, different water clarity in these two systems. And we have to work with that. I think earlier someone was talking about, the conditions of each one of the watersheds associated with the areas. This is what we're doing in terms of how we're addressing this particular question. So what are the key conclusions? We know that we're able to use our bio-optical model in our high salinity environment. We've calibrated there. Nathan calibrated it. We're ready to go in our high salinity system. The CDOM effect and the sediment effect have made it difficult to calibrate the model in our low salinity. But that process is underway right now, thanks to cooperation between the agencies and different sources of funding from APNet. So right now, Nathan is recalibrating the model for low salinity SAB environments. And when he's done with this phase of the work, we're going to have a tool that's pretty flexible and pretty durable. And it can adapt to any one of the water bodies in North Carolina. So once that calibration gets done, we'll be able to revisit or proceed with our Algal Sound work, which actually was the priority in 4.7 and 4.8 recommendations. It just so happens the model works in the high salinity because that's where we built it originally back in the early 2000s. So what do we do next? We meet in June as a SAC and contemplate the work that Nathan's done in his study. And then we factor that into the SAC's forthcoming guidance to you folks here on the commission. What are the key questions we need to be thinking about addressing on the SAC in this deliberation is, will a water quality standard for clarity provide sufficient protection for SAB? Are the current numeric standards for chlorophyll A and turbidity capable of achieving the water clarity requirements for their protection? And then third, are the assessment methods that exist today protective of SAB habitats? And then finally, are we ready to go ahead with the high salinity bio-optical model? It's calibrated and validated, it's ready to go. We just need to decide how confident our the SAC is in actually moving forward with it. So that was a lot. I hope I didn't lose anybody.
Thank you, Dr. Kenworthy. And before I start asking for questions, just wanted to reinforce again something Dr. Kenworthy mentioned, which is this particular issue is at the intersection of the nutrient management work, so the broader work on nutrient criteria and the specific recommendations of the Coastal Habitat Protection Plan related to submerged aquatic vegetation. So questions for Dr. Kenworthy? Commissioner Solomon?
Yeah, can you come back to your slide on the low and the high? And I guess just a couple observations and questions from the group.
Come on. You want,
The green one there, 13. Yeah, and I guess, well, I'll back up, because some of you from the west may not know, but the Albemarle Sound, if it goes to the previous one, go back to the previous one. Yeah, factoid, that salinity profile used to be different in the Albemarle Sound, for those in the west. The main inlet used to be at Corolla, which is up near the green that came straight in. And that was the first example we have in North Carolina, not climate change, but in 1838. The inlet closed up and it moved down to where the bottom bridge is. And the Albemarle Sound actually turned over. It was high salinity at one point, especially those lower reaches of it. And it became basically brackish or freshwater. And all the fish died in the stores in the 1830s and the 1840s were how bad it stayed through there because you saw the change in what was going on between a basically saltwater sound and a freshwater sound. It just closed up because of hurricanes in the 1820s and 30s. So just a factoid. But if you go to the next slide again and go to a question.
At one point, if you will move your microphone closer.
Sorry about that. I don't mean
And don't throw your glasses at me.
So
Thank you.
I guess to the chairman's comment, I get your comment on this. On the next slide, the green slide, where the low salinity is, I mean, that's really the battleground where we talk about fish kills, we talk about algal blooms, we talk about SAV, we talk about those transitions in that slide on the left, and that's where all the problems are, and that's where we can't ever get correlation. Like, why does an algal bloom sometimes cause fish kills or whatever, and sometimes they do. So I guess your opinion in working with this, will we ever get a good correlation in that zone? Are we always going to be more qualitative than quantitative in that area, do you think?
No, we can be more quantitative. I mean, it's going to take increasing our capacity and intensity of sample. Because that's what we're struggling with right now. Because basically the data we're working with originally are the stem channel stations that occur in the middle of Albemarle Sound. And what we really need in the future, and I'm hoping that we can have an opportunity to present this case, quantitatively, is we need to be able to have enough monitoring capacity to put stations where the SAV are, which are coincidental with these blooms. I mean, those blooms you're talking about have completely eliminated the SAV from this shoreline. And we watched it happen just between sampling events. So we need to increase our capacity of the intensity and frequency, and we need to locate our stations appropriately in the sound so they give us the most effective information.
Yeah, and we've just had the blooms a lot longer than the modern era and the fish kills, and that correlation has confounded us for 200, 300 years of figuring that out. So it's interesting. The other interesting thing I thought, and it gets down to qualitative and quantitative models, but you're basically taking a much less quantitative approach, much less laboratory approach, and making it more, and I like that. It's more instinctive. It's more on light quality.
Yeah.
But you are taking a little bit softer approach than a more numeric approach, which is intuitive to me and easier to understand. But can you talk about that a little bit? We're not talking about measuring things in parts per million anymore. A turbidity test is, you got to be trained to do it.
Turbidity is
Pretty high level.
Easy metric to measure. I mean, you can make it really challenging, like you can filter the water and call it TSS, but we can relate those two variables together and simplify it, and those can be inputs into the model. Yeah.
And then, last question, and the levels we're talking about, we're still, just a secchi depth won't do it in these kind of waters, because that's the simplest way to do it, right?
Yeah, absolutely, and I forgot to mention that. I'm glad.
Secchi depth is a
I'm
play.
glad you brought that, I'm
You'll
glad
probably
you
shake
brought
this
that up.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. So we can do that. We can measure the light reaching the SAV with a sensor and with a secchi disc. We can do that.
Tell them what
Works
a secchi
well.
is. Tell them what a secchi.
Yeah, what's secchi?
Oh, a secchi disc is a flat disc, typically either 25 centimeters in diameter, which is normally what we use in estuaries. We might use bigger ones in ocean. And it's a black and white disc that you drop into the water. And you drop it down, you look down at it, and when it disappears, that's your secchi. So basically, your eye is the sensor.
Yeah.
And there's some problems with it because of the sensitivity of your eye at different wavelengths and whatnot. But it works. It's a crude and rudimentary thing. But the problem with it is that you don't know what's causing the problem. That's why this model, using these fundamental routinely monitored water quality numbers, is so useful because we can relate back to what is the stress, what's causing that change in light. You get a secchi disc measurement, that's it. You know, the average light's reaching the bottom, but you can't link it back.
Do other commissioners have questions or comments? Commissioner Deerhag?
Thank you for the presentation. The Bio-Optical Model, you said was first developed for high salinity waters in the early 2000s. So has it been through peer review?
Oh, yeah.
And published?
So let me give you a little more history than that.
And then also, I'll go ahead and finish my question. You
Sure.
can address it all at once. The recalibration for low salinity, what level of peer review will this revised model receive? Are you considering the SAC the peer body, or is it going through a separate peer review through publishing? You can tell me all about that.
Right. So in answer to your first question, I started working with the Bio-Optical Model back in the early 90s. And the model we're using today was developed by a scientist, Dr. Chuck Gallegos, and he worked for the Smithsonian at the Environmental Research Lab in Edgewater, Maryland. And he developed that model in the Chesapeake Bay. I started working with him and we calibrated it and used it in Florida, on the east coast of Florida. Then we came up to North Carolina in the early 2000s, and through EPA funding, we calibrated and validated here. That's the one we're using right now. And then we also calibrated and validated it up in New England. So it's been through peer review about 10 times. Will the recalibration go through peer review? Absolutely, beyond the SAC. Because this will be really the first time that model is ever going to be effectively inserted into that salinity grid in North Carolina and for that matter, anywhere else. So that'll be a unique advancement in the model, in the model's application. It certainly will.
So,
Commissioner Deerhag?
so that leads me to a timeline question. So the SAC is going to meet and make recommendations for low salinity based on the recalibrated model that you say you should be hearing from this gentleman in June about. So will the peer review be completed in the same timeframe?
No.
It's a slow process.
Yeah, it is, absolutely.
So are we going to be confident that the information we receive, the recommendations we receive from the SAC on the low salinity model it's fully tested and proven?
So
Just a question.
I think it's safe to say that the commission can expect recommendations for the model's application to high salinity sooner than low salinity because the recalibration's not done. I'm not exactly sure when it'll be done. I anticipate we'll get it done during this calendar year as soon as possible. And thanks to the efforts by, all the partners, that's proceeding along. I can't tell you what the exact date, but I can tell you that we should be able to advance the high salinity model before the low salinity.
Okay, so when the recommendations are prepared for the EMC, be as clear as you can about the breakdown of what's being recommended,
Yep.
high salinity versus low salinity, and what the estimated timing is on the low salinity peer review demonstration, et cetera.
Okay.
And when you expect to receive recommendations on that.
Where's Kelsey?
Are there other questions from commission members? Commissioner Keen?
Can we go back to the slide on the low salinity and high salinity, please? I appreciate your study and presentation this morning, truly do. You've mapped it out well, and you've given two great personalities, and I like the personality piece. You mentioned that to get the high salinity here on the right, it does water ebbs and flows twice in 24 hours. It moves pretty good. It's constant, more so than it is inland. But in your science, looking at low salinity and trying to get that depth parameter in that area, it's quite a personality because it floods a lot. And the flooding over the last 20 years has been more dominant there than it probably has been anywhere in the state. It's hard, the water's hard to leave. When it floods, it's harder to leave. Wind tides come in. Commissioner Harris she knows all about that wind tides there and where she lives. But the area there, the study of weather and flooding, I would hope there would be a big part of science in that area. Flooding, bringing in the wetlands, what is predominantly wetter, and the water just doesn't move as much. So I would like to see that if we're going to work on that side, to see what the weather has done for the last 20 years in reference to the depth.
I can assure you that all of the folks that I'm working with on the SAC and in the partnership and in general are very, very sensitive and aware of the weather and the climate effects. And one in particular is precipitation, because we've seen over this 5-decade period that I've been referring to that built this composite. The lights go off and the lights come on. That yellow disappears and it comes back. And some of those relationships are associated with drought, high precipitation years. And so, everyone that I'm working with is got that humming in the back of their mind under consideration. And then, of course, the issue of rising water levels.
Yes.
Always changing that depth and, really squeezing the available habitat for the plants underwater. So
The topography here is certainly the sea level, but then we get up in here, it's not much more in some areas that development, impervious areas, all of that plays a big part in that circle there in eastern North Carolina. So I guess my question would be, Madam Chair and other commissioners, is that when we see these reports from other parts of the state and we address these models that we're putting together, that we certainly want to go back and I would think look at these areas as well.
I think you raise a good question about the different factors that the models will take into consideration in looking at high versus low salinity regimes. And I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to talk about that more as the advisory council comes back with recommendations and we get more detail on the models that they're using. Are there other questions, Commissioner Solomon?
Well, if I can add on here, I just want to point out, and again, this is great work, and I love this, and I think we need more funding for it. But implementation wise, I'd like to hear from the department at some point, because you go 13 in that block on the left, 22 on the right, and we know there's county lines and municipal lines and all that. So, and you're really going to implement this at a practical level. That's beyond what you're studying, and you know the danger you're smiling. I just want to hear what the department will say is how we do that to keep avoiding some of the other problems we've had in the past with nutrients and other things about where's the break line between impaired and not. So
yeah, thank you for that comment. And that may take us back to the earlier discussion of this is a long process.
yes.
But thank you. Commissioner Arata.
Probably a basic question, but are the light requirements between the low salinity and high salinity vegetation comparable enough where a single standard might be appropriate? Or are we kind of looking at a situation where we might need some variability based upon particular needs of the part of the sound that you're in?
Yeah. So their light requirements are sufficiently different enough that factor that into the calculation. That doesn't necessarily determine what the standard is, but it's a factor that we have to consider in terms of what we set the standard at. And it's interesting to note that the light requirements in high salinity are almost twice as great as the light requirements in low salinity plants, which is helpful in a way. The reason for that is that the high salinity plants are seagrasses. They're growing in that high energy environment, tidal environment with coarse sediments, so they produce a lot of root mats to anchor them into the sediment. And like I said earlier, that root mass, of course, you got to feed it oxygen to aerate it. So they have higher light requirement. The plants in low salinity, they grow canopies. They compensate for the quality of the water that they live in. It's darker, it's not clearer. So they grow taller canopies and produce less root biomass. And that, in a way, is helpful for us. But they're closer to all major issues in terms of water quality, being that much closer to the landscape.
Commissioner Bailey.
Yes, first, I really just have comments. So first, I wanted to say thank you for your presentation. I'm on the Coastal Habitat Protection Plan Steering Committee, as is Commissioner Anderson, and you've done a great job, I think, of breaking this down and making it understandable to people who aren't scientists like myself. So thank you very much for this presentation. And I just wanted to say that as we go forward with the Water Quality Committee, Marion Deerhake is chair of the Water Quality Committee. That's the committee that's going to be coming up with standards for that. And this is the sort of presentation, I think, that helps us understand these complicated issues. As we went through developing the plan, we had many experts briefing us on different parts of the plan, and a lot of work went into it. And I think this is an example of just one of the many pieces that that was a part of making our plan. So thank you for your presentation.
Thank you. I'm glad I'm really happy for your interest.
Are there any other questions or comments for Dr. Kenworthy? If not, thank you very much. That was a very helpful presentation. And as everyone has alluded to, the process on these different nutrient strategies is always to get the science first, understand the conditions, and then work from there to understand the variables affecting those conditions and figure out a management strategy. And that is a process. And look forward to hearing the advisory council's recommendations on the science and then moving into the discussion of strategies.
Before I leave the podium, can I make one more comment?
Just a second, Mr.
But all the maps that were shown are, we kind of squeezed them into the Atlantic region. So I want you to understand that, these maps are broken off, right about here, right? So there is a lot of SAV down here. It's by far not as big a resource as it is, but it's an important resource. It's part of the system. In magnitude, it isn't as large. So I want you to understand, for those of you who live in very southeastern North Carolina, and Todd pointed this out to me the other day, so make sure you point out, there's SAV there. Of course, we know that this is a growing area and there's lots of issues down there. So I just I'm not skipping that reason.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification. And Commissioner Keen, one more
Yes, ma'am.
comment
Just
or question?
In relation to the property line from the north down to the south, you mentioned thousands of acres just in that section that you,
Yeah.
okay. How much of that is federal? If we're talking about resources, dollars. I know a lot of the Manio, all of that, there's a lot of federal land. How many acres are under the federal?
No, actually, very little. So the Park Service in Cape Hatteras National Seashore and the Cape Lookout, they stop their jurisdictional boundary at the mean high water line. You go to South Florida in Biscayne National Park, they cover it all, so the S&P is in there. Here, that part of the Federal Service, there's probably some Fish and Wildlife Service refuge where SAV occurs, different young families.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. And excuse me, let me, I can recognize Mr. Kroll, who's the director of the Albemarle Pamlico National Estuary Program.
Good morning. I just wanted to address the timeline a little further that was brought up. Is we expect the draft report later this summer. Later in the early fall. Final report back to us at the end of the year. After that, then it will go through a public external peer review. But once the draft report comes to us, APNEP has a number of citizen advisory committees, science advisory committees, water quality monitoring assessment team, and an SAV monitoring assessment team composed of experts in the region, and they will be reviewing that as well. So there's an internal peer review process before we'll go to the external. The reason I mention this is that we want to get this report back out to you as soon as possible so that you can start making management decisions upon the newest information that's there.
Thank you, Bill. That's very helpful. Commissioner Deerhake?
So you're comfortable with the EMC beginning work on this before the winter peer review that you just mentioned?
I'm comfortable once we've conducted our internal review process with our external partners.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Kroll. The next presentation will be by Assistant Secretary Mazemore concerning the PFAS update. What I would suggest is that we take a quick 5-minute break while they're setting up the next presentation.
It's up there, you can just enter, you can press the item, but it's still not.
Just look at it.
Look like they got it. No.
Decompose a problem, to decompose a problem, it's really not.
Yeah.
It's a lot of people judge about
Can you enter the mirror? Yeah, that'll work. And then the mouse, it's just the here. So,
This is, because all these lights I was talking about. We have two copies for that. This is interesting. It is. But it's like I said, there's nothing like this.
And we appreciate having Assistant Secretary Mazemore here to provide an update on activities related to PFAS.
Good morning, Madam Chair and members of the Commission. I'm Sushma Mazemore. I'm the Assistant Secretary for Environment at DEQ. First, thank you for allowing us to provide an update on PFAS. This is an important topic, and I think it's a good timing for you all to be briefed on where things are. But before I even begin, I just want to acknowledge that what I represent here is a component of what we know and what's going on in our state and across the country related to this subject. I want to acknowledge the hundreds of folks within our state, our academic community, our communities themselves, our regulated community, our department itself, 4 divisions behind me. Their staff have been working on this topic and this issue for almost 5 years now. And my goal here today is to give you a high-level overview of what we mean by PFAS, just scientific definition, some history, and what we know thus far, followed up with our understanding of PFAS at one of our plants that we've been permitted and through which the last 5 years we've been working on the cleanup of that operation. And then I want to back up into, well, what do we know statewide outside of that experience? And then our current activity with the Science Advisory Board, which is where do we start? What are the most prevalent and predominant PFAS constituents that we as a state should focus on? So with that, I'll get started with a little bit of background on PFAS. When we talk about PFAS, PFAS, it represents a large group of human-made chemicals that are not found naturally in the environment. PFAS represents per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances. These synthetic compounds or chemicals have been used in the industry and consumer products. They've been introduced worldwide since the mid-1900s. They are used in food packaging, stain and water repellent fabrics, non-stick products, firefighting foams, and more. And over the years, thousands of such chemicals have been developed and used widely due to a variety of physical properties. But these same properties also challenge us in the environment as well as the health concerns. EPA currently has 600, about 7,000 PFAS chemicals that are used in commercial applications and consumer products. One characteristic of PFAS is that they do not readily break down or degrade over time. They persist in water, soil, and other media over very long periods of time. And as a result, they are found in many bodies of water, and they're also found in human blood, they're found in wildlife, and they're found in soil. Scientific studies do indicate that for PFAS that have been evaluated, reproductive and developmental, liver and kidney, and immunological effects have been observed. So as a result, there is a tremendous focus on PFAS across the country. And I mentioned here a few of the uses of these chemicals. This slide shows some of the commonly used products. However, PFAS are manufactured directly by a small group of industries, but they're reformulated through multiple activities, either through at industries or also in other forms. They're also recreated through its reformulation in the environment. We do know that they enter the environment through fire training and response activities, and AFFF is one of those PFAS related chemicals that are widely examined by the Department of Defense, also our division, and many state agencies. At industrial sites, PFAS can be emitted to the atmosphere from exhaust stacks, from fugitive emissions, or other events from manufacturing operations. They can enter stormwater, wastewater, or surface water systems through direct discharges, through spills or runoffs. So as a result, as I mentioned, they've been around since the 1940s, mid-1900s. They have accumulated in our environment. And as a result, we also see them in landfills, see them in wastewater treatment facilities, and we also see that their effects in biosolids and other byproducts that are created from those processes.
just like to clarify, you don't see those facilities used, landfills and wastewater plants, water plants typically use PFAS that much. They pass through, right?
Yes, it's
The
a
other
result.
folks,
Yeah, it is a result of the operations and the products that they manage. When we talk about perfluorinated PFAS, these are fully fluorinated carbon chains with a charged functional group. So PFAS all have carbon-fluorine bonds. And perfluorinated PFAS, the terminal end of those bonds is what's different. They don't degrade further than this particular molecular state. When we talk about polyfluorinated PFAS, the carbon chain is not fully fluorinated, and there is an OH component or an alcohol functional group. And here an example is 8,2-FTOH, is a fluorotelomer, and it is also one of what we call legacy compounds. These long-chain PFAS have been introduced into the environment for longer time than others. Those with greater than 8 carbons are called perfluorocarboxylic acids with carbon chains lengths greater than C8. These legacy PFAS have been phased out in the U.S. and in Europe since about 2015. Their replacement has been the short-chain PFAS. Both PFCAs and PFSAs that I mentioned are considered alternatives or replacements. However, their increased concentrations are deemed to be more difficult to be detected and also measured. Generally, these fluorinated compounds are either carboxylic components, such as Gen X, and they're used in a variety of current products manufacturing. They may or may not be less environmentally hazardous. We're discovering that these short-chain PFAS are also just as important for human health concerns as the others. So I'm going to now transition to what we know about PFAS in the Cape Fear region. Through extraordinary work that was done by research scientists in North Carolina, and we discovered that PFAS were present in water and other media surrounding the Comores facility in Bladen County. And based on these findings, the department conducted a variety of sampling and analysis and did confirm high levels of PFAS compounds on site in the monitoring wells, as well as off-site surrounding the facility. DEQ confirmed both the presence in water, wastewater, and surface water. In 2017, the Department of Health and Human Services in North Carolina established a Gen X drinking water health goal of 140 nanograms per liter. This was as a result of our building understanding that this particular operation had a group of PFAS compounds that were, we call signature compounds, that were unique to them. And Gen X was one of them. In late 2021, which is just about last year, we did confirm that the contamination of these signature compounds had reached New Hanover County. And then about 2 weeks ago, through our groundwater monitoring, we confirmed the presence in both Brunswick and Pender counties. We are in the process, and I will explain a little bit further off-site assessment related to this facility. This slide shows a general timeline starting in 2017 when surface water and groundwater issues were discovered. And again, as I said, one of the sources of primary contamination was uncontrolled stack emissions, fugitive emissions from unit operations, and other airborne releases from the plant. Another major release point was identified to be untreated processed water discharged to the river. And so a consent order between the department, Comores, Fayetteville Works Facility, and the Cape Fear River Watch was signed. And this consent agreement serves as the regulatory vehicle mechanism through which many of the current activities have taken place. In addition to what I just mentioned, an immediate activity to stop emissions as well as discharge to the water was initiated. through our Division of Air Quality, a thermal oxidizer was identified as the best control technology for reducing air pollution. And that particular operation has been going on and working to a reduction of more than 99% destruction efficiency of the compounds. The consent order also required the company to conduct private well monitoring and to provide alternative drinking water options if they exceeded a certain threshold. If they exceeded the 140 DHHS health advisory, then they're given replacement water for the whole house or connection to the municipal water supply. There are also other thresholds, 10 and 20, depending on whether it's an individual compound or combined, that triggers under the sink replacement filtration options for the homeowners. This 140 that I've mentioned remains the current threshold for making whole house filtrations. However, in a few weeks, EPA is expected to release a health advisory level for Gen X. We're expecting that level to be much lower than 140 based on the reference dose that they had released in the fall of last year. And so we do think that additional homeowners are expected to be brought into the program as receiving alternate drinking supply. This chart is a little dated. It's about 6 months old, but Michael Scott, our Director of Division of Waste Management, uses this often. The gray area is the location, the property boundaries of the plant, and the yellow areas indicate where any PFAS, where Gen X was over. I'm sorry, I can't read that far. Where individual PFAS was over 10 parts per trillion, and the red areas are where we detected Gen X about 140 or so higher than in those wells. So as you can see, the expanded monitoring is going on up to about 18 or 19 miles. We're up to about 8,000 wells tested so far in Bladen County and Cumberland counties. And so that brings to mind main point here, which is the November 3rd letter from DEQ. We basically asked Moores to expand the offsite monitoring into 4 other counties, and that's New Hanover, Brunswick, Pender, and Columbus counties, and submit a monitoring plan and a drinking water replacement plan. We are working on reviewing a variety of revisions that have been made, and as a result, we've also started our own monitoring to better understand where the contamination may have been in those lower Cape Fear counties. And so about a couple of weeks ago, our Division of Water Resources staff completed their monitoring of the groundwater wells that are under our purview. And they, as I said again, in this chart, you'll see the color-coded dots, which are the blue, and they're detections of PFAS were determined, and Chemours-related signature compounds were in about 75 to 99% of the water samples that are in those circled areas. We did not detect these chemicals in the further out regions of the counties, and the theory has been somewhat validated that as the water intake from the Cape Fear River was brought in through the water intake from a variety of plants and collection systems, that contamination filtrated and released through leaky pipes and other activities. And as a result, we think that that PFAS has emerged to those regions. So part of our next strategy is working with Chemours to sample these wells in the next coming weeks and months, focusing primarily on those areas that we have detected higher levels of PFAS, focusing on areas where distribution and collection and sewer systems are known to exist, focusing on areas around the river itself within the floodplain. And so there have been about 4 to 5 eligibility criteria that has been established. Homeowners.
Let's hold questions till the end.
I'll come back, sorry. Homeowners have been notified through by Comores. About 11,000 letters were sent out. And our department and leadership was in New Hanover County this week to communicate that the opportunity exists for them to get their wells tested. So thus far, about 78 or so wells have been tested, and it should be right here. And it has been detected in about 4 of those wells, so that they have exceeded the consent order thresholds. We expect to receive more requests for testing, and our staff will continue to monitor as the third party from Comores make arrangements to get the waters tested. We're also working with the utilities, New Hanover County utility CFPUA, as well as the Brunswick and Pender County utilities are very active in the space. They are monitoring raw water intake as well as finished water. 2 of those utilities are putting very expensive treatment systems for PFAS. And our department is working close with them as well as the community in building the next stage of response. We're expecting an additional 50,000 or so letters to be sent out in the coming weeks by Comores to notify them of their options. I'm going to transition here to what we're seeing related to the drinking water sources. As I mentioned, that 3 of the utilities are already all 4 utilities are very active in this space. This shows the data from the PFAS networks. This is run by the collaboratory. Is the PFAS testing network data that was collected in round 1. This does not include the round 2 data. We're still in the process of getting that. But it basically validated that Comores-related compounds have been detected in all 4 counties with predominantly PFMOAA, and not Gen X has been discovered in 3 out of the 4 counties. And I think the data here shows that 7 samples were over 20 parts per trillion for PFMOAA in 4 counties. And I'm going to transition now to what's ahead at this operation. The groundwater from the contamination over the last few decades from the site continues to flow into the Cape Fear River. This is the largest remaining source of PFAS from the site that is impacting the river water quality. Under the consent order, the company is required to address the flow by removing 99% of those PFAS compounds. And the remedy for that has been a barrier wall that is designed to prevent the flow of the groundwater contamination into the river. As I mentioned, currently all of that contamination is flowing into the river. A 70 feet high, about a mile long, 2.5 feet thick wall would be underground, preceded by a series of extraction wells that will extract the water, contaminated water, and that would enter a treatment operation where the design is to remove 99% of that PFAS. We're currently in the process of going through a public hearing for the Npds permit for that treatment operation. And a notice has been sent out for that public noticing. And there's been a lot of interest, and I just want you all to be aware of that our department is working to address those comments that we're receiving from the public. They're not only in this space, but also PFAS in general. We've been doing our best to communicate to the public. We have an active outreach program in answering the community's concerns. We have folks that are available over phones to help out with their understanding of what they're seeing. And so I want to transition to what we know about PFAS throughout the state. Through the PFAS network, there was a general characterization of, based on the multimedia sampling that they did, where PFAS has been detected. And this shows not a high-level quantitative data set, but in general which counties of the 95 or so counties that were tested where detections were made. And most of these are in your more urbanized counties. And that's a good, important item to remember as we move forward with an approach to better understand where they are and what we do about them. This slide here shows from the network what we detected in terms of some of the more common legacy compounds, PFOA and Pfas, in the sum of those two. We do know that PFOA is detected in at least 53 counties, 2 of them over 20 parts per trillion. When you combine the 2 as the sum of those, they were detected in 59 of those counties, and 9 of the counties had over 20 parts per trillion. I want to come back to a little bit of what you all were familiar with. A couple of months ago, PFOA and Pfas, IMAC was in front of you, and the proposal was to proceed with a 70 parts per trillion level based on EPA's 2016 advisory. And the reason that our department took a second look is the CDC released an ATSDR value for PFOA and Pfas. And based on that analysis, which was just proceeding before we came to you all, the final numbers showed a reference dose that was much lower than the 2016 EPA analysis. We went to the Science Advisory Board, and majority of the advisors basically said we should wait until a revised reference dose is released by EPA, which is expected in the coming weeks. We do know EPA presented their recommendation to their Science Advisory Board, and that reference dose is expected to be significantly lower than what is currently in the books. And we do want to come back to you all with how do we translate that into, protection of surface water and groundwater systems. Another thing we're doing is, like I mentioned, we have about 700 or so groundwater monitoring wells. These are our ambient monitoring wells. They're used historically for a variety of purposes. We completed the analysis in the 4 lower Cape Fear counties. We're proceeding to other counties surrounding, and we want to expand this approach to the rest of the state. And so over the coming months, and hopefully not years, but as funding becomes available, our goal is to characterize those compounds that are currently able to be detected throughout the state through our groundwater monitoring network. This slide shows the work that our Division of Waste Management has been doing, and they have prioritized areas where PFAS has been detected, and also the areas where sources where we need to do more learning. The work on AFFF by our DWM team is expanding. And I'm sure as you ask questions, I'll pass on to our team here for expanded answers. As you can see from here, the AFFF, or the purple dots, are areas where there's a lot of focus, and so has PFOA and Pfas. So backing up into what does this really mean? This is a snapshot of what we know. So one of the questions that many states are wrestling with, and I'm sure EPA is too, is how do we regulate or better understand control of large group of chemicals for which we may not know all the scientific, may not have scientific data or have all the health impacts. So we do know that many PFAS don't have enough data, and we need a minimum of a reference dose to establish any kind of drinking water potency level. And so our goal has been to understand what other states are doing. Few states are regulating PFAS based on guidance from EPA, while others are moving forward on their own through state-specific assessments and regulatory authority. One of the key things that is common amongst all of this is the need for a reference dose. The reference dose is considered at what level is the health effect so negative that you need to reduce the consumption or use of that product. And that reference dose then ultimately is translated into a either advisory level or a drinking water standard or a surface water standard. And so we as an agency have known that for those compounds where we can best get information on reference dose, we could get a better understanding what those levels needs to be. We know that EPA, as you know, the roadmap was released in the fall of last year. There's significant work happening at EPA on multimedia impacts. Not going to go into the roadmap activities today, but we're happy to integrate that into a future update. Most recently, the roadmap did announce enforceable drinking water limits for PFOA and Pfas. EPA plans to propose that in the fall of this year and finalize next year. They have issued a hazardous substance designation under CERCLA, and they have issued a timeline for actions for effluent guidelines for 9 industrial categories. They have increased monitoring, data collection, research, and the UCMR 5 between now and 2025, I believe. Additional wastewater and industrial discharges will be monitored through that program. They are planning to release a final toxicity assessment. They've released the final toxicity assessment for Gen X, but the final advisory will come out in a few weeks for both Gen X and PFOA and Pfas. And then want to move on to PFAS priorities for North Carolina. So we pulled all of the PFAS data that we know from the multimedia, including air, surface water, and well water. And we presented this data to the SAB over several meetings. About 20 most recurring PFAS are in all media that we looked at. And we've begun literature search for these 20 PFAS. And as the next slide shows, the group on the left are what we call EPA PFAS roadmap compounds. These are specific compounds that EPA is examining on their own, and they're planning to release either advisories or reference doses. They're in various stages, and we think that as long as EPA does that in a timely manner, that data can be used for state decision-making. The group on the right, most of the ones that are they're in light green are consent order PFAS, and they are detected in our waters. So one of the priorities that we're placing is completing toxicity studies for them and using literature data that may exist today to be able to come up with reference doses. And so this is a schedule that on the left side is what has been completed and what is in progress in various stages. I'm not going to go through the slide, but as I mentioned, the priority PFAS that we have asked the SAB for recommendation as to where we started out with this list of analysis that our key toxicologist, Dr. Franny Nelson, presented to the SAB. Basically, we examined everything that we have in hand today and grouped them in the legacy compounds and the Comores-related consent order compounds. And combine them with, not going through this table, combine them with the data that exists. That means where have they been detected and at what level? And then based on that, we basically asked the SAB to give us priority over examining which compounds is the department going to first pursue in terms of further evaluation through the regulatory process. And we're expecting the next SAB meeting in June to answer some of these questions. And to come back to the importance of reference doses, RFD is used in our groundwater to well standards. It's used in our surface water 2B standards. It's also used in the drinking water maximum concentration level regulations that EPA develops. So it becomes the starting point for so many standard development. And in the 2B rules, this is the equation you all are very familiar with. In the last triennial review, we came back with this information. The reference dose, as well as the, what we call the bioconcentration factor, are two critical parameters that are needed to apply in this water and fish consumption standards development. And without that data, we cannot apply this formula. And so our goal is, through the SAB and the North Carolina scientific community, that for those priority PFAS that have been identified, that we immediately begin compiling literature and assessing scientific work to establish the parameters that are needed to equate to a level that is considered acceptable. In the 2L standard for both IMAX as well as groundwater standard, the reference dose is the only measurement that is needed for developing a threshold. In the Drinking Water Act, this is slightly different. We basically, our Division of Public Water Supply section, over the years, just adopts the federal drinking water standards and regulations. And we have the ability under North Carolina Drinking Water Act to implement not only the national water regulations, but also examine those that may be state specific. And it has been very seldom applied. But if it was applied, the process would be very similar to how the federal government develops MCLs. First, they establish MCL goals. This is very analogous to the advisory that I just mentioned, which are dependent on the reference dose. These are non-enforceable public health goals. And then move on to an actual MCL, which is the contamination level after considering technology and cost. What is the level at which it is achievable? These MCL process is a very mathematical, engineering, and economic analysis of what the system would allow and can deliver, and that is feasible in the real world. And so as I come down to the last bit, I just want to say that the utilities that are currently in the process of starting up or investing millions of dollars into treatment systems, there's one element they do not know, and that is how clean do those systems need to be? Without a finished water level, which, the replacement, the O&M requirements for those GAC systems or RO systems are dependent on that level. So the cost of operating these systems is contingent on the discharge concentrations. So if this body and the scientific community can assist those communities and those utilities as to what is an acceptable drinking water level, then the systems can be designed and the costs and operations of that can be evaluated. And so I want to come back to the importance of how these levels are decision support tools for not only this body, the department, and DHHS, but also those communities that are putting in engineering solutions. I'll finally say that one approach to develop the reference dose for which we may not have scientific literature is to go and collect our own data. And our team with DHHS and DEQ, as well as our other divisions and Wildlife Resource Commission have now embarked on a fish tissue sampling and analysis. During this summer, from May through August, a large-scale fish collection event will take place. 300 individual fish will be collected along the Cape Fear River. And we'll be happy to provide a report out later on this. But the main goal is, as these samples are collected, we would analyze them, and our academic community will assist in building the foundation for further understanding of PFAS in the future. In summary, our Water Resources Division is working on PFAS foam, both surveying, sampling, and reporting. I mentioned the groundwater testing of monitoring wells across the state. We're also working on adding PFAS monitoring and reporting in Npds permits, as well as publicly owned treatment facilities. EPA just announced about a week ago that they're using their draft method to be able to allow this monitoring to get started. And then our DWM folks are working on, as I mentioned, the landfill leachate and other hazardous waste sites and AFFF responses. Our Division of Water Quality continues to do the air deposition monitoring at all of our monitoring sites, in addition to the Comores facility where significant stack testing, analysis, and deposition monitoring has been occurring. We're also looking at the facilities that are manufacturing or formulating PFAS to better understand whether there could be any other sources that we may need to work with the community as well as the industry. And so I'm going to conclude here, and thank you for your patience for this long overview. We want to focus on PFAS that are found in North Carolina. EPA's strategy is broad and large, and they're looking at a national approach. We in North Carolina will need to examine what is prevalent and what is of most importance in our state. We're utilizing the Science Advisory Board to begin that scientific information synthesis in deriving the reference dose for North Carolina PFAS. We will need assistance from other academic institutions and this body and other commissions to be able to support any pathways that are considered deemed appropriate for our state. And then finally, the fish tissue analysis will help support the scientific data gathering. So I'm going to pause here and any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Mazemore. Before I take questions from other commissioners, I'm going to ask one of my own. So to clarify on your early part of the presentation about the most recent well monitoring and the wells that were further down the Cape Fear River Basin, did I understand you to say that the theory at the moment is that likely those wells are being contaminated because PFAS entered the water systems, came out of the water systems because there's been no treatment available, and then leaked into groundwater through water lines and other means? Is that essentially the idea?
That is one of the key hypotheses, and based on the data, I think our priority areas to look at is where all of the pipelines are for drinking water as well as sewer water. But it's not the only hypothesis. This area, as you know, has been inundated with hurricanes and flood events. How it got into the groundwater could be a variety of pathways, but the pipelines and the system, the distribution of that system is the primary that we're looking at.
Thank you. Commissioner Bailey?
Thank you for the presentation. It was very helpful. I live in New Hanover County, so I get questions from time to time. This will help me point people to the right way. I do have a question out of just simply curiosity. You said you're going to be sampling fish over the summer, like 300 samples. Is that DEQ staff or are you using volunteer organizations? How is that going to be accomplished?
So the Division of Marine Fisheries and the Wildlife Resource Commission are our primary groups that they're out there. And they do collect samples themselves. So we've coordinated and we have a work plan, testing plan that's been put together in a matter of weeks, just so we could use this season for this purpose. Our team, as well as DHS's team, knows a lot about it, and I'm happy to give you more details later.
Other questions? Commissioner Solomon?
Yeah, can we go back to your earlier slide? Assistant Secretary Sushma Mazemore, and one says current groundwater monitoring well data in Lower Cape Fear River. Fairly early. And I apologize, I thought I had the answer to this, but then you said some things that confused me. When you report this detection level, I was under the impression that this was at 140. What is, I mean, you don't have a legend on here to say what the detection level is. That makes a big difference.
So here we're talking about groundwater monitoring well data for those what we call attachment C compounds that are in the consent order. So we're talking about those. We have both total PFAS as well as those attachment C compounds. When they exceeded the consent order levels are shaded in blue.
So that's not 140, that's the individual constituents. Okay, so the next map is a different scale, right? Because that's at the 20 and 70. So that's not necessarily equivalent to the previous map.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Oh, yes, this map is showing, and Michael Scott, you can fill in here, this map is showing drinking water well data for those homeowners that requested sampling thus far. The green circles show no detections where no PFAS, those attachment C PFAS were not detected in those areas. However, the yellow circles represent residences who did qualify for an RO system because PFAS was detected over 10 for an individual.
So I'm fishing for the contours, right? I'm risk engineering, so I'm looking for 10, 70, 140, and I can't tell that in these maps. And then when you go down to your other map, further down, about 5 or 6 down, I guess the question here is you're giving me percentages. It's the one with the state on it with the different colors.
Oh, this one, yeah.
Yeah. And so I see percent, and that's the number of detects, but it's not, is that a detection level too? I'm fishing for the detection levels of the, what we're calling hot and what we're calling not hot, I guess.
Understood. This was just to illustrate that when they did all the sampling, the PFAS network, where did they find PFAS in those counties that were above the analytical detection limits for those compounds that were measured? That's what this map is showing.
Which,
This
okay.
one right here.
Yeah, no, I got it. I got 3 different graphs and I'm not looking sure. I feel like I'm looking at apples and oranges.
Well, I think my purpose for putting this chart is to just demonstrate that PFAS was sampled in multimedia across the state. And if you had to take a snapshot of where detections were based on the analytical sensitivity of a given compound, 15 to 20% of the samples collected detected in those counties. That's what this is showing. My other 2 were specific to the implementation of the consent order. And that is when PFAS were detected over 10 parts per trillion for one given compound in that attachment C, or over 70 for the total, or over 140 for Gen X, then they received replacement. They replaced bottled water in those 4 residences recently. And as we move forward with more sampling, that those numbers are going to change.
Will we be, and this is my last question, will we be able, you got to this at the end with the water, wastewater plants and all the industries. Will you be giving us in the fiscal note, an idea of at 140 or 70 or 10 or whatever the numbers you're giving us at, what the different economic impacts will be? Are you going to come in here and say it's all undeterminable, just do the most strict one?
We can't do that. That's the reason I'm here, is to explain that we need first a scientific basis for these compounds, whether it's one or all. How we group them, if they're individual or together, there's a rationale for the science as well as grouping. Some states have grouped them because they said these 4 or 5 are most prevalent in their state, and we're going to establish standards together. For us, we got to start with the scientific literature to be able to establish a reference dose first. And from there, we can understand what those thresholds or standards could be.
And you'll be putting cost of those for the fiscal note that will be required for this too.
Absolutely. That's part of the rulemaking.
Yeah, let me just add on that point, a fiscal note or a regulatory impact analysis is required for any rule the commission adopts. So at the point where the department comes to us with a recommendation to actually adopt through rulemaking a standard, then there would have to be a regulatory impact analysis. I think part of what makes all of this so challenging to get your arms around is we have different things going on in different types of programs, and the numbers are not the same. So, for example, under the groundwater standard, since this commission has not adopted a numerical standard for Gen X, the default standard under the groundwater rules is the detection level. but that's not the health risk standard that's used to identify people who are entitled to an alternate water supply or a water filtration system as a result of the Chemours contamination. So you do have different numbers, but they're being used in different ways. And when this comes back, if this comes back to the commission with a recommendation, whether it's for a groundwater standard or a drinking water standard or an effluent limit, then we would have to look at what those fiscal impacts are. Other questions? Commissioner Davis?
Yes, this slide here, this testing network, what type of testing, what type of samples are you taking, are you using to create this map, and have any sources been identified related to this?
This data was derived through the Collaboratory's Pfas testing network. There's a report that was submitted to the legislature.
So are these wastewater samples? Are these fish tissue samples? What type of samples?
It's a variety of that.
Okay.
Yeah, and maybe I shouldn't have put this slide in here. My main purpose was people want to know where in North Carolina have we detected PFAS, and this was just an illustrative way of understanding. This is the most comprehensive testing that has been done in our state, and they have looked at all the PFAS that are measurable, and this is where they found it. And I can forward you the link to that.
And have any sources been identified related to this testing, or is that not yet a part of this?
They have, like I showed earlier, they've identified not one or two sources, but the activities that contribute to a collective concentration of PFAS. So it's wastewater treatment, it's consumer products that enter water. It's also what's been legacy compounds in Hanover County and all the downstream counties, not just Gen X and Chemours related compounds. We're also seeing other legacy compounds that have traveled down the river and accumulated. And when I mentioned PFAS foam, that's also something that is relatively new. No certified test method exists on how we can sample or test. And our team here over the last year has developed at least a process and procedure to collect the samples and examine it through analytical equipment.
And thank you for including this slide. I know it's generated some questions, but I think it's an important piece of information for us. Thank you.
Other questions? Commissioner Deerhake?
Thank you. I know this is probably not a fair question to ask, but the time frame for the drinking water versus the surface water standards, do you think they'll follow a similar schedule, or do you think the surface water will take longer?
So let me start out with the surface water standard. That's under our purview. Those PFAS that EPA has examined and reference doses available or will be available, or an advisory is going to be issued, I believe that we may have enough scientific data to be able to propose something. We just want confirmation from the SAB that these prevalent compounds in North Carolina, we could start out with 20 or we could start out with 5. Where, what is that? How do we bring the funnel down to what comes out first? And we want to base it on where do we have the most scientific information? And is it occurring in North Carolina? Have we detected it at what level? And that becomes a priority compound that we look at. And then we would proceed to coming to you all for next steps. For drinking water, it's a different matter. As I mentioned, that it is under the mission of public health. We have rarely established our own MCLs at a state level. If we wait for EPA, the earliest MCL we will have is for PFOA and PFAS. That's next spring or fall next year. And so there is an opportunity for us as North Carolinians to decide, how much of this do we take on ourselves to be proactive. At least 5 or 6 states have moved forward with their own MCLs for PFOA, PFAS, and other compounds that are prevalent in their state. And so that's a model and or approach that could be applied here. And those definitely require technology and assessment, cost benefit and analysis, fiscal review.
Did you have a follow-up question?
Yes, the second question I had was about the engineered wall project. And that's very interesting. Has it been piloted or bench tested, or it seems like a very big investment? I hope that it works.
I'm going to refer to Michael Scott if he has any other responses that have been tested.
Yeah, Michael Scott, Director of Divisional Waste Management. Two-part answer, great question. There will be a piece of the barrier wall that's constructed first. We're talking with Chemours about how long that initial piece will be. The full wall length is over 6,000 feet long, 70 feet deep along the Cape Fear. They will build an initial piece of this wall first through the wind one-pass installation method, and they will test that piece of the wall in situ, if you will. There's also a very complex model. It's in FEFLOW that our technical team is reviewing along with Geosyntec, who is Chemours' consultant, regarding the modeling of the design walls. So I hope that helps with your question, which is a great one. But there will be not only the modeling piece, which we're currently working on, there will actually be a piece of installed wall that's then tested as the other kind of on-site testing parameters and ongoing testing as it's installed, along the whole 6,000 feet length.
And are all of those specifications part of the record for the Npds permitting process?
I would say they're all part of the record in that the 90% design is, being reviewed by our staff right now. As far as the upcoming Npds permit, all of these documents are available. Sushma, I don't know if you want to comment on what we've loaded, or DWR staff may be able to help with what we've loaded as part of the Npds permit, but it's all in the public record regarding anybody that wants to review this. We are getting some questions from the public on the wall design. We are responding to those. And so, that information is available, and we'll follow up on your specific question. Has all of that been loaded as part of the Npds, documents that are online?
Thank you.
I'll just add just one other follow-up that I think some people may not realize. It's not just the wall itself. There's a groundwater extraction system. So it's really twofold. So there's a series of wells that will remove the groundwater, to your point, then go to the treatment system, which is related to the proposed Npds permit. And then there's the wall itself. So it's a two-part system, a barrier wall with extraction wells.
So just to be clear, is the wall part of the permit, or is it just the extraction and treatment from the wall that's the permit?
The Npds permit is for the treatment system.
Okay.
Any other questions from commissioners?
I don't have a question, Madam Chair, but I'll have it.
Commissioner King?
I think you said it best in Wilmington back in March, that it's the greatest environmental challenge of our generation with what's going on in Gen X. It reminds me of coal ash, but Gen X, the people, the stakeholders down in those counties, New Hanover, Brunswick, Bender, all up the river, kicking the screen, what to do. So I just thank you for Secretary and air quality and presence that y'all went down to Wilmington and did a great presentation for where we are thus far. And I just hats off to, did a great job, got a lot of coverage, local coverage. I think you answered a lot of questions with your presence, and it's just a huge thank you. Several phone calls to me just thanking whoever, and I wanted to let you know that the local elected officials and the local people, the business people, I think there was a lot of questions answered. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Keen. And you do, remind me this is a priority for us. It's a priority for the Secretary. It's a priority for a lot of people. But we can do this together. One nice thing is the treatment systems work. when you think about years ago when we were looking at other air contaminants, water pollution issues, we didn't know what was out there to remedy and control or reduce those pollution. So we are working with a good body of knowledge. The question is, how fast do we move and what can we do to answer the concerns of the community? And there are probably some PFAS that are probably not prevalent, or the health data may show that it may not be an issue, but thus far, we're looking at those that we do understand better.
Any other comments or questions? Yes.
Yes.
Mr. Pilkington.
Excellent presentation. Thank you so much. But just wanted to understand how effective the measures you've taken so far have been. In the area around Chemours and along the Cape Fear, how extensive have you seen improvements through the monitoring program?
So the first few years, we're just talking about one source here, and I don't want this presentation to be diluted from the big picture.
Yes.
We have, and my projector is here, 99% of the air emissions have been reduced. The discharge to the Cape Fear from the process or the operation itself has been eliminated. The groundwater is the only thing left. But we are still seeing in the raw water intake of, let's say, CFPUA, measurable quantities of GenX and PFMOAA. And PFMOAA is what we consider an indicator parameter, and it's also the first one to break through these treatment technologies. So how quickly those carbon beds are replaced, is a function of which compound breaks through fastest, and the water gets contaminated. Again, the finished water levels go higher. And that raises most of the operating costs for the plant. And we're trying to best figure out what is that safe level. And help those utilities with that answer.
Okay, so that's a good answer. So with the groundwater monitoring you've done, have you seen declines in levels in the groundwater wells around them?
I don't know if I can answer that because we have, again, the groundwater, the ambient monitoring, all of it just got started recently. We've been struggling over funds, but we prioritized this. So now that we have a starting point, at least for many of the wells that I just mentioned, we'll go back in future years to see what impact that has.
Okay, great. And one other question I had, earlier this year, we had our groundwater committee met with public staff, and we were talking about solar decommissioning, and they mentioned there was just one community, I think it was in Beaufort County, that had concerns about had environmental concerns, and I looked through the docket, and it looked like there were concerns about the PFAS on solar panels, being the extensive area that solar panels would cover. Has the department looked at that community and made sure that didn't affect their groundwater supply in that area?
I didn't know that was something that the public staff had received comments on the docket. But like I said, PFAS can enter through so many different sources. To isolate on the best we could understand is it on the material itself, and is it getting into groundwater or surface water? I haven't heard that, but I'm happy to look into it.
Okay, that sounds great. Thank you very much.
Mr. Solomon?
Just to note that I do have to dismiss myself. I want to stay and hear this, but in leaving, it was a great presentation. But I do want to recognize a former EMC member, Ken Waldrop, who is in the audience. And about a year ago, he took over Cape Fear Public Utility Authority. And so he has been working on the ground. So just wanted, before I leave, to recognize him in my comments that he is here. And he is one of us who appreciates what we have to go through. So a great resource for the future for us. So.
Yes, he indeed has been a resource for the state and for local governments for a long time. So if no other questions or comments, one final comment, I guess, it seems like this situation is a good example of the ways the state and federal governments, they play and need to play different roles on a problem. And just to think about the role of drinking water standards, as Secretary Mazemore indicated, the state does have the ability to adopt drinking water standards that go beyond the federal standards. So for contaminants, the federal standards don't address. And one reason that may be necessary is because one of the criteria for the federal drinking water standards is how prevalent that contaminant is nationwide. So if it's not prevalent nationwide, you're not going to see a federal standard or not see it very quickly, for sure. And part of the reason for that is the logical reason that once you adopt the standard, then every drinking water system has to test for that contaminant and treat it. So there are going to be situations where North Carolina has a specific problem with specific contaminants that needs to be addressed and isn't likely to be addressed by federal standards. So thank you very much. I'm sorry.
This question on that comment?
Yes, Commissioner Geen.
Then can we use this because it's a discharge directly into the ocean, which is federal waters, instead of the sounds? So can we couple some requests moving forward with anything that we're doing with the Cape Fear into a federal piece because of the contaminants indirectly in the ocean?
Well, in terms of surface water, we already basically have a coordinated program under the Clean Water Act. And so the EPA guides that program, directs the states to adopt standards for the waters that are within state jurisdiction. So that really exists on the surface water side. It's a little different for drinking water standards because those are specifically standards for drinking water systems, so treated water, and it has to do with how they treat the water, what the quality is when it comes out, the treatment process. Groundwater's different too because there are no federal standards for groundwater. There are only state standards. So it's a mix of different types of authorities for different purposes. But I do think we have a very strong, certainly a strong working relationship under the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act to address many of these issues. It's always good to look for money, yes. If you find the mattress to look under, that's a good plan.
Well, it's a good point, actually. The bipartisan infrastructure bill does have set asides for PFAS related assistance to states. It's just not enough, but it'll be a good start. And we're using that as part of this decision making. How do we best leverage resources to North Carolina, but also, as we construct these treatment systems or perhaps other alternatives to addressing this, maximizing those resources to North Carolina, so we could actually solve the problem.
And thank you very much.
Only one more thing I'd say is if in the future there are specific topical things what I told you today that you'd like a briefing on, any one of us would be happy to come back in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. So we are at concluding remarks and we'll turn to the division directors first. So I'm not sure I'm going to follow. I probably will fail to follow unless I pull it up. The order of the written comments. You've received written comments from the division directors. So I will turn first to Deputy Director Pajetra, who's here for Air Quality Director Abrazinskis.
Yes, thank you. Right here.
Not so much.
Green lights on? No?
I think we're fine.
Check. How about that one? That one works?
That seems a little better.
Okay, great. Thank you. Commissioners, good morning. I'm Michael Pajetra, Deputy Director with the Division of Air Quality. Thank you for your time this morning. I want to start my comments with a note that isn't included in your comments. It's a somber note. Heather Sands, our Title V permitting branch supervisor, passed away on April 17th of this year after a long battle with cancer. On a personal note, we're going to miss her and her smile and her great attitude for all of her colleagues. On a professional level, her work ethic to create products and to protect citizens of North Carolina is going to leave a big hole for the division and for the citizens. So I just wanted to share that with you. Next topic is the Regional Haze State Implementation Plan. The Division of Air Quality submitted the state's Regional Haze State Implementation Plan for the second planning period on April 4th, 2022. The final SIP was prepared in accordance with the federal regional haze rule provisions and EPA's guidance for implementing the rule. The plan locks in our path to continued progress to reach natural background visibility by 2064 and considered comments from a variety of stakeholders through the SIP development process. In the notes that you have, there's a link that provides more information regarding the regional haze SIP. Discussion about some of our air quality successes. As we celebrated Air Quality Awareness Week during the first week of May, it provided a good opportunity to share the positive progress we've made in improving air quality in North Carolina. In fact, today represents the 2,453rd consecutive day that North Carolina has been designated as attaining all federal ambient air quality standards. Getting there has taken a lot of work. Just last month, we celebrated the 20th anniversary of the Clean Smokestacks Act. That historic piece of environmental legislation required coal-fired utilities to reduce emissions of nitrogen oxides by 77% and sulfur dioxide by 73%. Not only did we reach those reduction levels, we actually have exceeded them. Today, we're looking at an 82% reduction of NOx and a 97% reduction of SO2 from coal-fired utilities. As a result of clean smokestacks, levels of ozone and particulate matter have decreased. As an added benefit, the technology to reduce those emissions also reduces the amount of mercury emitted. The legislation has improved air quality, improved the health of North Carolinians, and has improved visibility. The discussion of the National Ambient Air Quality Standards related to particulate matter, EPA's Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee, also known as KSAC, has recently finished their review of the fine particulate matter, or PM 2.5 standards. KSAC approved recommendations that have now been sent to the EPA to lower or to strengthen the annual PM 2.5 standard. The standard is currently at 12 micrograms per cubic meter. KSAC submitted a majority and a minority report to the EPA. The majority report recommended an annual PM 2.5 standard to be set somewhere between 8 and 10 micrograms per cubic meter. The minority report recommended a range between 10 and 11 micrograms per cubic meter. So both reports have recommended strengthening the current standard. For the daily PM 2.5 standard, which is currently set at 35 micrograms per cubic meter, KSAC submitted two reports. The majority report recommended a daily PM 2.5 standard be set between 25 and 30 micrograms per cubic meter. The minority report recommended retaining the current 35 microgram per cubic meter daily standard. KSAC also reviewed the need for a secondary PM 2.5 standard in the form of a visibility standard. The most significant recommendation in this review was related to monitoring for visibility using a federal reference method. It's DAQ's understanding that an EPA proposal on the PM 2.5 NAAQS is likely this summer. So we're looking at what-if scenarios. Current data shows that our highest design value in North Carolina for the annual PM 2.5 standard is 9 micrograms per cubic meter. So even if EPA lowered their standard by a 25% amount, we would still be in attainment of any new NAAQS. If EPA finalizes the new PM 2.5 NAAQS in 2023, then we would anticipate data from 2022 through 2024 would likely be used in the designation process. We're also watching whether there may be any policy changes on the treatment of wildfires as exceptional events. And finally, DAQ is watching whether a strengthened standard will come with additional ambient monitoring requirements for states and locals, and whether that will also come with additional federal financial support. Final note that I'd like to add, another unscripted note, May 2nd through the 6th was State Employees Appreciation Week. So I'd like to just take a minute to thank all my peers here today, as well as Sushma and everybody else, as well as all the other members of our DAQ and DEQ staff, and just thank them for all their work they do for the betterment of the environment in the state of North Carolina. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Pajetra? Mr. Scott, you are next up in the written comments.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, members of the Commission. Michael Scott, Director of the Division of Waste Management. I'd like to thank all of the DEQ communications team and our solid waste staff and those additional colleagues from the Division of Environmental Assistance and Customer Service. We did complete the consolidated solid waste report and submitted it to the General Assembly last month. This report entails all of the disposal data, the waste generated in North Carolina, the tonnage that was disposed. Last year, municipal solid waste, construction and demolition waste streams, that was a total of almost 14 million tons, went to our permanent landfills. It also includes the references for updates on the recyclable tonnage for our state, how much happened of recyclable material that was managed, and a lot of other great information to include our driving programs and brownfield programs. So just want to let you know that report's been submitted to the General Assembly. It's available online and has a lot of great annual report information relevant to the Division of Waste Management and Environmental Assistance and Customer Services and programs. On the rulemaking updates, we did hold 2 virtual public hearings for rules that came before the Commission on May the 3rd. The 0500, 1600 C&D and MSW landfill rules went through a public hearing process. There was 1 attendee with no comments. So those rules will be coming back to the Commission here, most likely at the next meeting. On May 9th, there was also a public hearing, the readoption and amendments for the O2T, Commercial Leaking Petroleum Underground Storage Tank Cleanup Fund rules. There was also 1 attendee at that public hearing and also no comments. So appreciate all the colleagues that worked on those public hearings and the support of the Commission for that. As we've mentioned before, we continue to work on the Colonial Pipeline release in Huntersville, North Carolina. There's been just over 1.3 million gallons of gasoline recovered from that pipeline release. We continue to work with Colonial on some remaining outstanding items that are addressed in the complaint that we filed with Estuary County Court, and we're looking forward to hopefully getting those additional items resolved in the very, very near future. And on an additional note, Sushma covered all the Pfas items. So my final item, we did have a great hurricane training exercise this week. Don't forget, hurricane season is rapidly approaching. So a lot of DEQ divisions participated in this mock exercise and training event along with our partners at Emergency Management. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Scott? Mr. Wren.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, Commissioners. Thank you for the time this morning. On April 27th, the Onshore Wind Energy Program received its first formal application for an onshore wind energy facility permit under the Permitting of Wind Energy Facilities General Statute. The Timber Mill Wind LLC project proposes to construct and operate a 45 turbine wind facility on 6,300 acres with a nameplate generating capacity of 189 megawatts in Chowan County. The next steps for the application include notification to stakeholders on the receipt of a complete application with a public hearing required within 75 days of the receipt. The Onshore Wind Energy Program anticipates holding the public hearing in mid to late June 2022. Decision on the application is required within 90 days of receipt or approximately July 26th, unless additional information is requested. The stormwater program currently has 3 Npds industrial general permits that are expiring in 2022. The NCG 14 for our ready-mix concrete facilities, the NCG 15 for airports, NCG 24 for composting operations. These renewals are being drafted at this time and are currently under review by the EPA. Once we have those comments back and the drafts are ready to go, they will go to a public notice period for 30-day comment. Also on the stormwater front, the 2 Duke Energy Npds industrial individual industrial permits have some updates. The Allen Steam Station was issued or renewed on April 13th, 2022. And the Rogers Energy Complex, which is formerly the Cliffside Steam Station, individual industrial permit is currently under the 30-day public comment period, which ends May 13th. Our dam safety program, with the assistance of Freeze Nichols, has completed a dam risk safety tool that will identify deficient dams that are at risk for failure. This training has been conducted to all of our regional office and central office staff to use this tool, and it will also facilitate prioritization of funding through our high hazard potential dam grant program offered by FEMA. Admiral received over $500,000 this year to assist local governments with high hazard dam repair and maintenance. And the anticipated funding for next year is over $1 million for repair on these dams. Finally, we're extremely pleased to have Danny Smith as the Division Stormwater Program Manager. Danny's leadership, experience, and his depth of knowledge on water quality and stormwater issues will be a huge asset to Daimler. We look forward to working with him more in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. I have one question about the high hazard dam project and the use of the grant program. So what is the scope of that grant program? Or does this include dams that are privately owned, say a homeowners association, or is this strictly local government owned facilities?
So primarily it's for publicly owned dams, so dams owned by local municipalities. However, there is an opportunity for a privately owned dam to be funded through this grant program if it is sponsored by a local municipality. So they work in partnership.
Thank you. I know we had a number of issues across the state with small dams that turn out to be high hazard because of the location. Any other questions? If not, Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Commission members. It's a pleasure and honor, quite frankly, to be here today. I'm a recent addition to the department. Been here about 2 months, so I'll go through my update and then I'll close with just a couple personal comments. Emerging compounds update. I think Secretary Bazemore did a good job there. I will, one issue there, the Npds permit that was discussed some. We are planning a public hearing in June. We're looking at Cape Fear Community College to have the public hearing and most likely a virtual public hearing the day after. 1,4-dioxane on April 22nd. The RRC delayed the approval of the 1,4-dioxane standard due to questions on the fiscal note. That issue will be coming back before the RRC in May. The city of Greensboro had a violation of its special order of consent for 1,4-dioxane on April 5th. Effluent standards exceeded their limits, Greensboro reacted very quickly, began an investigation, and actually found the industrial user that violated the 1,4-dioxane standard. Further investigation is going on that as well. Downstream in the town of Pittsburgh, the standard looking at the violation in the Pittsburgh, the standard elevation was only 11.9 micrograms per liter, so it was below the required standard, and the water downstream was safe as well. We involved, and I know Commissioner Deerhake and Chair Smith were involved when the release of the 1,4-dioxane was identified, and I don't know whether they have any additional comments on that or not. They're welcome to comment to that. Drought update. 10 eastern counties remain in severe drought, while 18 remain in moderate drought status. The remaining eastern portion of the state is categorized as abnormally dry. Meanwhile, the western portion of the state is no longer in under drought conditions. Permit related to animal waste management disaster digester system general permits There were 4 public hearings held in April in Duplin, Sampson, and Iredell County, as well as a virtual hearing. It was well attended. Public comment period was closed on May 2nd. Permits are compelled to be issued by July 1. We're on track to get that done. Standards development. Yesterday, the Water Quality Committee heard the E. coli standard and our process there, updating them on how we're moving forward with initiating a statewide E. coli standard. Chronic silver, which is another interest of the Water Quality Committee, and I know the Commission staff is conducting a literature review of published scientific studies. In March, a permitting section issued a guidance document for pretreatment operators to help them deal with the implementation of the numeric standard. And we are continuing to work with them to make sure the guidance is followed, to make sure that it meets their needs as well. And we'll continue to work with them on working through that issue as we move forward. On April 19th, I presented to the Joint Legislative Oversight Committee on Agriculture, Environment, and Economic Resources on the implementation of a numeric standard for silver. We will continue to work with pretreatment operators on this guidance to help them meet the standard that's required. In general terms, most facilities are not going to have any problem meeting the silver mass loading. Some will have some issues, and we'll commit all our resources available to help them through that issue as well. In the development of the new standard, we'll also continue to work with the North Carolina Water Quality Association and staff in looking at the chronic standard and how to manage that in the future. So I just wanted to take a moment of personal privilege in coming back to the department, and it's an honor, as I said. One thing of note that I recognized immediately was the employees. There's been no change there since I left in 2007. Employees are working above and beyond what's required. We are struggling trying to get positions filled, but the folks and staff continue to do their best, continue to serve the public in a great way. It really makes you proud to serve the state of North Carolina. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers. Any questions from commission members for Mr. Rogers? I'll just say on the 1,4-dioxane issue, I'll speak for myself, but Commissioner Deerhig can add anything she would like. She and I were both on the call from the department when they identified the source of this most recent exceedance. And I have to say that was pretty exciting news. And one thing I wanted to remind commission members of is the role the commission's played in approving the SOC and working with the department to get the expanded monitoring in place, because that clearly made a difference in how quickly they were able to identify the source of this exceedance. So that was very exciting news that we're getting some results from that process. Anything else from commissioners? Otherwise, we'll go to the committee chair's reports, and Commissioner Arata.
Thank you. The Air Quality Committee met yesterday and heard one concept, one informational item. The concept was on the sulfur dioxide emissions from combustion sources rule, which might sound familiar because it was the topic of the recent petition for declaratory ruling that came before this commission. And there the question was whether or not supplemental fuel beyond what's needed for combustion may be used under the rule. And I think there's a general feeling among the commissioners that the rule could be a little bit clearer. And so the department has gone back to amend that rule, and that'll be coming forward to the committee in the near future. The informational item had to do with House Bill 951, which is the energy bill that requires the Utilities Commission to go ahead with the planning and rulemaking process to meet certain carbon dioxide reduction goals at set times in the future. There have been questions on the Air Quality Committee and the Commission in general about how that process might interact with the RGGI rulemaking petition this commission is considering. So there's some good information in those slides, giving some background on what the Utility Commission process is looking like. There will be a plan coming out at the end of this year that we will probably need to revisit, as that might answer some of the questions that still remain at the committee level. That's all I have for today.
Thank you. Commissioner Bailey, I know your committee did not meet, but do you have any comments?
We didn't meet, but I just wanted to comment that it looks like more of our activities require some kind of coordination with the public utilities staff or commission. You know, like the last time we met, we were talking about solar panels and the waste from solar panels, and we needed to get it quantified, which had to go back to the Public Utilities Commission to bring the whole thing together. So likewise with the air quality permitting and trying to get the reductions, it's a similar thing. We have different matters, but the data needs to be shared. And I hope to see that a good working cooperative relationship between the two entities.
Thank you. Commissioner Deercake.
Thank you. Water Quality Committee did meet, and we had 3 action items. The first was a request to bring to the EMC in July the 2022 Yadkin River Basin Plan. That is the 4th in a series of plans produced for that basin over the decades. It was an extensive report, excellent research and compilation of data about the status of the basin. We thank Commissioner Donna Davis, who is our liaison for that basin, for working closely with Virginia Baker and the staff on developing that package. And we heard many messages coming out of that, including recommendations for increasing the amount of monitoring. We're very short on monitoring in that basin, as we are across the whole state. And that's a resource, a funding resource issue, and staffing in turn. So we have a number of issues in this heavily used growing basin. In particular, what became very apparent to us in the report was concern for the Rocky River Basin and the need for developing a nutrient management strategy for that basin as well. So we heard a presentation this morning on the nutrient criteria development program. We think that Rocky River needs to be part of that long-term plan for strategy development there. That's, as you may know, is part of the Charlotte metropolitan area. So our second action item was a request for approval to proceed to the EMC again, probably in July, with proposed reclassification of the tier quarry and a section of the Eno River from critical, from WS4 status to critical area. This is a quarry that will be used for water storage for the city of Durham, and withdrawal will be from the Eno River. This is a long-term effort to develop this request and get it to us. An environmental assessment has been done by the applicant, with the result being the finding of no significant impact to the Eno River with withdrawal. But there are a lot of conditions built into that associated with lake levels that are required before withdrawal can occur. So, again, we voted to bring that to the commission at our next meeting. The third action item was a request to proceed to the EMC with a revised Noose and Tar Pamlico new development stormwater local programs. In March of 2021, the division brought to us a request to consolidate and revise, improve the model program that local programs use for new development. We, as a result, are having 23 requests for local program approvals, which we delegate authority for new development standard implementation and oversight at the local level. So 12 of the 23 came to us yesterday as a package. Those 12 communities and counties are existing programs. And in July, we will probably hear the 11 new communities and counties that will be required to develop local program plans and adopt revised or new ordinances to comply with the state level standards and rules. So we collectively approved bringing the 12 existing programs, new plans, and revised ordinances to the full commission in July. Those ordinances are not adopted by the town councils and counties yet, but we have been assured that substantively those ordinances will go through as they are. If there are any significant changes to the ordinances once the town councils or county commissions consider them, this will come back to us for review and consideration. Then we had two information items. Director Rogers mentioned the E. coli calendar, which we had requested a calendar for statewide adoption of the standard at our March meeting, and the division brought that back to us. Basically, the work will involve contracted bacterial studies for the appropriate seasons of which E. coli is of most concern. And as a result of that, because we are where we are now in May and the need to look at April, it will cross over 2 years. One season, the latter half of the season of interest will begin this summer, and then they will pick up in April in 2023 to catch the remaining months of seasons that are of most interest. Given all of that, it looks like adoption at earliest would be, or not at earliest, hopefully they can find an earlier date, but adoption is currently proposed for November 24 with RRC review in December of 2024. You may ask, how is this different from a triennial review schedule? It could be somewhat shorter. We want it to be a more accelerated schedule to switch from fecal or to add E. coli to the fecal monitoring. But the staff believes that the bacterial study is really key to deciding what the impacts are statewide, implementing a rule such as this. So it will take time. We encourage them to look for all efficiencies as possible in their calendar to accelerate schedule if at all possible, while not risking the quality of the work that needs to be done. And then the second information item we heard was the 303D list update and prioritizing waters for restoration in North Carolina. And Mr. McNutt gave us that presentation. He also has videos that are available to us to show us how the mapping systems work, which he'll provide, which we ran out of time and didn't have an opportunity to look at. But it sounds like those are very well worth our viewing, something that the public can interact with also. Bottom line about the 303D list update, the new listings, it appears that we're not achieving any improvement based on the movement of things from complying to not complying. Part of that deals with the new methodology for listing that was implemented a couple of years ago, but also it deals with the lack of data in some cases that leads to uncertainty about the conditions of some of these streams. Again, this is an issue of monitoring resources and lacking the appropriate resources needed to go out and monitor these streams. So if any message came out of this month's meeting, it's continued need for more resources for staff and for monitoring expenses that are, go along with better understanding the state of our water quality. From that, I believe that's all we covered.
And that was a fair amount.
Yes, it was.
Thank you. Are there any questions? If not, Commissioner McAdams, your committee did not meet.
In counterpoint to the Water Quality Committee, the Water Allocation Committee, yes, did not meet, and I have no report.
Okay. So other commission members, or commission members generally, any personal comments? Commissioner Anderson, Commissioner Arada, Commissioner Bailey, Commissioner Carter.
Yes, one quick thing. Since I was identified yesterday as the mastermind of the presentation we had on the HB 951, I thought maybe I'd continue in that role and suggest that we heard yesterday that the Duke Energy will be issuing its proposed, I guess it's a multiple option plan under the carbon plan required by HB 951. And I was simply going to suggest that we look into getting someone from Duke on our agenda for the July meeting and get a briefing on what kind of options they come up with and what we should expect there.
And are you proposing that as a committee presentation again?
That's probably the best way to do it. It seemed like it worked, and then we had more than just the committee there. And so,
correct. We did try to arrange that, yes, so that other commission members could.
But if it's on the full commission, then I certainly.
Well, I'm certainly supportive of that, so I would leave that to you and Commissioner Arata.
Maybe we can check in offline to coordinate schedules and talk with the division first.
Thanks. Commissioner Davis, Commissioner Deerhay.
I thank Chair Smith and the division and all the interested participants today for the nutrient criteria development program planning presentation. I think it was very useful to have an overview of that. So thank you.
Commissioner Motz. Nope. Commissioner Duggan. Mr. King, Mr. Kelvington, Mr. McAdams.
If I may, two things, I'll make them quick. One is for me to express appreciation to the Division of Air Quality, Assistant Director Pejetra and Director Abrazinskis, and I mentioned this to him yesterday, for getting on the sulfur dioxide clarification so quickly. In our January meeting, we in the majority resolved to issue or grant a petition allowing the dilution that was going on to meet a standard. And I'm sure that the department, the division, has a lot on your plate, but you got on that very quickly. And speaking for myself, and I think for all of us, we appreciate that quick response there. And then finally, just generally as to the staff, and to echo some of what Director Rogers just said, I am continually impressed by the quality of the staff that serves this commission. It is very heartening. I'm further gratified that the members of the staff choose to serve our state in their professional careers. That said, if it is possible to get agenda materials out before the Tuesday before the meetings, for some of us, I am one that needs preparation time. And I can engage in the meeting, frankly, much more effectively if I have a few days in advance. I know it's tough. I know the staff is short. I appreciate so much the efforts of the staff. But if the materials could be available even as much as the Friday before, the weekend before the meetings, that would be good. Thank you. Thank you, Madam.
Thank you. Commission Council, do you have any comments?
None.
No comments from Commission Council, who will be visiting the Rules Review Commission on your behalf on Thursday.
Saving all my words for that.
That's right. He's biding his time. So on that note, I have nothing else. Thank you for your attendance and the work in the remissions committees yesterday. Look forward to seeing you in July. We're adjourned.
The review on that. 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 The review on that.